In the first half of the 7th century, the Muslim Caliphate burst out of the Arabian Peninsula, defeating both the Eastern Roman and Sassanid empires in a series of decisive battles, shocking the ancient world and changing the status quo of the region forever. In our previous 2 videos on early Muslim expansion, we described these events in detail. By the middle of the century, the conquests continued, but the cracks started to show. In this episode, we will talk both about these conquests that brought the Caliphate to its largest extent, from France to Central Asia, and the internal strife that first ended the Rashidun Caliphate, bringing the Umayyad dynasty to power and starting early sectarian divisions, weakening the Umayyads in the process. Welcome to the 3rd long-form video in our series on the early Muslim expansion. These long videos are difficult to make and the algorithm is currently unkind, so we ask for your support to continue producing our videos. Please like, share, comment and subscribe. Initially, the reign of Caliph Uthman ibn Affan was a time of progress for the growing Rashidun Caliphate. The governor of Egypt, Abdullah ibn Sa'ad, had used the new standing navy of the Caliphate to secure a steady tribute from the island of Cyprus in 649, before defeating the Eastern Romans at sea in the Battle of the Masts. Meanwhile, the advancing armies of Anaf ibn Qais and Abdullah ibn Amr were making further headway into the rapidly crumbling Sassanid Empire. Yazdegerd III, last of the Persian King of Kings, had been reduced to little more than a fugitive, fleeing from city to city ahead of the conquerors. After the fall of Fars province between 649 and 650, attempts to raise support in first Kerman and then Sekistan each failed, with the governors of these provinces refusing to pay taxes to a destitute and powerless emperor or harbour him from the advancing Arabs. Finally withdrawing to Merv, he made a last-ditch effort to stem the tide by appealing to his allies among the Hephthalite principalities. Some soldiers were indeed sent to support him, but they would never see battle against the Arabs. Unwilling to continue throwing away lives in a hopeless war after the desertion or surrender of Yazdegerd's vassals, his last general Farrukhzad abandoned him in 651, with Merv's governor Mahu-Isuri turning against him as well shortly after. With his last supporters defeated by Suri's own Hephthalite allies, the King of Kings finally met his end, hiding in the home of a humble miller outside Merv, murdered for his jewelry. While local resistance would continue into Baristan for years to follow, the once great Sassanid Empire had ceased to exist, its dynasty continuing only through a family of exiles taking refuge in China. But for all the military victories of the Caliphate during Uthman's 12-year reign, its domestic policies would soon beget internal turmoil for the young and rapidly expanding state. The aging caliph's nepotism and unpopular economic policies created growing opposition to his rule from various strands of society. During Umar's reign, laws had been set in place forbidding Arab soldiers from buying land in conquered territories, keeping soldiers strictly separated from local populations, both to prevent foreign influences on the faith of his victorious armies and to protect the property of the conquered. Under Uthman, these restrictions were removed, causing many soldiers in the Caliphate's armies to buy up huge tracts of land in Syria and Iraq, in some cases abusing their power and authority in order to drive inhabitants out and resell the same land at large profits, creating a new class of wealthy ex-soldiers establishing lavish estates across the Caliphate. This new taste for luxury among the conquerors drove up taxes and created great resentment among both non-Muslims and non-Arab converts. On top of economic friction, Uthman also created for himself a theological controversy through his creation of a unified official version of the Quran. Prior to this, the ad hoc nature by which the Prophet's revelations were recorded and transmitted by his closest companions meant that many Qurans had minor variations in the text from one to the next, undermining a faith based on an eternal and infallible word of God. To correct this, Uthman had a gathering of religious scholars determine the canon account of the Prophet's words, gathering and burning as many of the variant Qurans as possible. The Quran of Uthman remains unchanged as the holy text for Muslims around the world today. But during his reign, some Muslims disagreed with the decisions Uthman's scholars reached, or saw the destruction of any Quran as sacrilegious, adding their voices to the growing opposition to his rule. The long-simmering resentment against Caliph Uthman boiled into open rebellion in 656. In Egypt, Kufa and Basra, disaffected soldiers from local garrison towns gathered and marched on Medina to demand Uthman's deposition and the election of a new caliph. Having been told by agents that the grievances against him were frivolous and a revolt unlikely, Uthman was caught unprepared when the bands of soldiers converged on Medina. Though he refused to step down as caliph, Uthman attempted to reach a peaceful settlement, sending Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's son-in-law and one of the first Muslims, to negotiate with the rebels on his behalf. The smaller Kufan and Basran detachments were convinced to make peace with Uthman, while the larger Egyptian force was mollified with a promise to remove their unpopular governor Abdullah from governorship in favour of Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, the son of the first caliph. With Ali as guarantee of the agreement, and Ibn Abi Bakr leading them, they began their return to Egypt, apparently ending the immediate danger for Uthman. But on their return journey, the soldiers waylaid a messenger bound for Egypt with orders to have the rebel leaders executed. Taking it as a sign of treachery on Uthman's part, the rebels returned to Medina and surrounded Uthman's home, besieging him within, and once again demanded his resignation. Whether Uthman really ordered the rebels executed is unclear, with most accounts crediting the message not to Uthman but to his cousin and secretary, the future caliph Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Whatever the truth of the matter, the rebels cut off water to Uthman's house and gave increasingly threatening demands for his abdication, until one of Marwan's servants slew one of the rebel spokesmen with a stone from the balcony on June 16th, making a bloody end to the affair all but inevitable. Abandoned by most of his Umayyad clan, with the Iraqi rebels and notables of Medina remaining neutral, Uthman ordered his remaining defenders to stand down in hopes of avoiding bloodshed between Muslims when the rebels attacked the house the following day. Regardless, Marwan and the children of Ali refused this order and attempted to save the life of their caliph. As Uthman sat for his noon prayers, Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr and a few of the Egyptian rebels climbed into his home from the roof of a neighbouring house, threatening the caliph at sword point. Though accounts differ on the specific events, and on Abi Bakr's role in particular, the final outcome was the same. Uthman was the first caliph to be murdered by his fellow Muslims, an event that would shake the Muslim world to its core. Following the murder, the rebel bands effectively controlled Medina, and under their influence, particularly the Iraqis, Ali was elevated to the role of caliph. As the Prophet's son-in-law and one of the major candidates in the previous election, Ali seemed a safe and popular choice. However, his reign would be saddled with the scandal of Uthman's murder, and demands for justice placed the new caliph in a difficult position. Given Ali's efforts to defuse the rebellion and the injuries his own son Hassan suffered in Uthman's defense, it is incredibly unlikely he had any role in his predecessor's murder. But many of the rebels who had opposed Uthman were now his most important supporters, so punishing them would have alienated his power base and potentially led to his own demise. Stuck in a trap, Ali allowed Uthman's murder to go unpunished, which led to accusations of weakness and complicity, particularly from Uthman's powerful Umayyad clan, laying the groundwork for the First Islamic Civil War. The first stirrings of conflict came from Talha ibn Ubaydullah and Zubair ibn al-Awwam, Ali's main competitors in the election that had brought him to the throne. In the past, the two had fought alongside Ali as comrades. But despite Talha's own previous opposition to Uthman, they had been among the most vocal for action against the rebels, and were quick to make common cause with another of Ali's detractors, Aisha, the widow of the Prophet himself. with Aisha as the unifying spiritual figurehead of the rebellion. Funding from numerous Umayyad governors deposed by Ali at the beginning of his reign, and several prominent Muslim leaders, including Marwan and the murdered Caliph's son, Aban ibn Uthman, flocking to her banner, Aisha's rebel army represented a significant challenge to Ali's leadership. Unfortunately for the so-called Mother of the Faithful, a number of crucial mistakes would undermine her cause. A great deal of effort was wasted trying to rally support in Iraq, despite most of the region being loyal to Ali. Then, when rebel leadership left Mecca to gain support in Basra in mid-October 656, internal discord fomented within their cause. Talha and Zubayr were jockeying against each other for authority, while the secrecy of the army's destination created resentment from Marwan and the Umayyad clansmen within the army, who saw the insurgency more as a blood feud than a rebellion, and would have preferred to simply march to Medina and execute the conspirators who had slain Uthman, rather than waging a campaign to topple Ali. The anti-Ali movement was dealt another blow in December, when Aisha and her followers arrived in Basra. After hearing the speeches and calls to arms of Zubayr and Talha in the marketplace outside the city, the reaction of the Basran populace was divided, with some offering support, while others denounced her. The first fighting of her rebellion occurred immediately after, when numerous market-goers loyal to Aisha or Ali began to scrap in the marketplace and strike each other with the soles of their shoes. More important than any marketplace brawl, however, was the response of Basra's governor, Uthman ibn Hunayf, who remained loyal to Ali. However, reluctant to bring bloodshed to his city, he allowed the rebels to camp the night while he waited for word from Ali, who was now on his way from Medina. A message from the Caliph soon arrived, instructing Ibn Hunayf to give the rebels an ultimatum of loyalty to Ali or warfare. But by then, Aisha's army had already managed to entrench themselves in a defensible camp near the local garrison's storehouse. It should be noted that even after Caliph Uthman's murder, the thought of outright warfare between Muslims remained almost unthinkable to most, and so the prominent poet and scholar Salim ibn Amr al-Duwali was sent to make a last entreaty for peace and to end the rebellion. When it was refused, Basra's cavalry commander Hukaym ibn Jabala stormed out with the governor's local forces. A short and bloody battle around Aisha's camp ensued. Many on both sides died, but the rebels were not dislodged. Afterwards, an uneasy ceasefire was signed, intended to last until Ali's arrival. The ceasefire would be short-lived, however. If Aisha remained unwilling to submit, Ali's arrival would only leave the rebels hopelessly outnumbered. So, on Talha's advice, a party of rebels captured the Basran governor in a surprise raid as he led the evening's prayers in the mosque, giving him 40 lashes and plucking his beard and eyelashes before imprisoning him. The following morning, Zubayr's son Abdallah led the rebels in an attack on the storehouse, killing 40 converted ex-slaves from Sindh who had been posted as guards, and seizing the grain meant for the townfolk's winter provisions. Hukaym arrived shortly after in a great rage, demanding Abdallah release the governor and berating him for the killing of Muslims innocent of any role in Uthman's murder. When Abdallah refused, Hukaym attacked with the 700 men still with him, finding himself quickly surrounded and overwhelmed by the larger rebel army. Though he fought fiercely until the end, fatally striking one of the rebels with his own severed leg, according to one rather fanciful account, Hukaym, his son, and many of his soldiers were killed, with the rest fleeing or surrendering, and leaving the rebels in full control of Basra. With Ali en route, the victorious rebels had little time to gather support for their movement. Though control of the city and its treasury brought most of the surrounding tribes at least nominally under Aisha's banner, emissaries sent north to Kufa had less success. While the province's governor, Abu Musa ibn Ashari, attempted to remain neutral, Kufan notable Zayd ibn Suhan, after receiving a message from Aisha fondly addressing him as a beloved son, as befitting her title of Mother of the Faith, responded that her beloved son would prefer her to stay safely at home. Ali's efforts were more fruitful. Sending his son al-Hassan to Kufa, Abu Musa was soon deposed, and more than 6,000 men were gathered for the retaking of Basra. With these joining Ali's 700 from Medina, and close to 2,000 who had gathered from various tribes along the caravan route, Ali arrived at Basra on December 5th with just under 10,000 men, met by Aisha's comparable army of Basrans and Meccans. After 3 days of standoff and attempts to sway the Basran tribes, a horseman was sent between the armies by Ali with a Quran at the end of his lance to exhort both sides to an honourable combat. When he fell dead, pierced by arrows, battle was joined, and the two cavalry-heavy armies came crashing together like thunder. Despite Aisha having, by most accounts, at least as large an army as Ali prior to his arrival, defections of several Basran tribes, both before and during the battle, weakened her force significantly. In the centre of Ali's army, Abu Qatada al-Numan led the Kufan foot soldiers, while Ali's son, Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, carried his father's standard. On the right wing of Ali's army, Malik al-Ashtar led the bulk of the Kufan cavalry, soon routing the tribesmen of the Banu Hanzala leading Aisha's left. And on Ali's left, the storied companion Ammar ibn Yasir is said by some to have driven Zubayr, who had been given overall command of the rebel army, to abandon his army and leave without fighting. Zubayr's desertion is a matter of some mystery. Despite his past victories and talent as a commander, all accounts agree he abandoned his army and retreated very early in the battle, though there are a variety of reasons given. Some suggest that secret correspondence from Ali convinced him he had taken the wrong path, or that the Prophet had once said that Ammar would die at the hands of a band of wicked men, leading Zubayr to question his role when the two came face to face on the battlefield. Others point to Aisha's refusal to acclaim him as Caliph on the eve of the battle, suggesting that she favoured Talha and that Zubayr's role in the rebellion had been a self-serving grab for the throne. Either way, his desertion left Talha to take command of a rapidly worsening situation. Leading a strong force of Basran cavalry, he made a number of charges against Ali's left and centre, at first with great success. But once Ali's right wing punched through his lines, he found his mobile cavalry bogged down and risking envelopment. Turning about to withdraw and regroup for another charge, he was mortally wounded by an arrow to the back of his knee, not at the hands of Ali's forces, but of his supposed ally Marwan, apparently as a spiteful act of vengeance for Talha's opposition to Uthman now that their alliance to punish Ali and Uthman's murderers had come to naught. After firing the treacherous shot, Marwan was taken prisoner by Ali's victorious forces, while Aisha's leaderless forces collapsed. Named the Battle of the Camel after the camel Aisha had observed her defeat from the back of, this climactic battle in Basra had ended the first major challenge to Ali's caliphate, though further conflict remained ahead. Various figures are given for the casualties, with generally accepted figures hovering around 400 for Ali's army and 2,500 for Aisha's, the latter number being particularly high given that Ali pardoned all but one of the prisoners taken after the battle, but still plausible given the accounts of many rebels fighting on long after the army had fallen into disarray and defeat out of zealous devotion to Aisha. Of the three rebel leaders, only Aisha survived the battle and its aftermath, being escorted back to Medina by her brother Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, where she would live her days out in comfort, but with her political activity greatly curtailed. Zubayr was found shortly after the battle's end by a trio of tribesmen and murdered while apparently trying to escape to his ally Muawiyah, the governor of Syria. At its foundation, the caliphate had been ruled and organized largely through the consensus of the companions in Medina, but for all Uthman's merits, his reign brought a definite shift away from the ideals of justice and Islamic unity the early caliphate inherited from the Prophet. In pre-Islamic Arabia, life had been divided sharply along clan lines, but under the caliphs Abu Bakr and Umar, Brotherhood under Islam had superseded the tribal loyalties that existed before their faith. In his speech upon becoming the first caliph, Abu Bakr had emphasized to the gathered Muslims of Medina that he was not the greatest among them, and that he would welcome the help and truthful advice of his subjects, even if it meant speaking against his own suggestions. And though Abu Bakr had adult sons, he passed the caliphate on to his advisor and fellow companion Umar, rather than attempt to create a ruling dynasty. Umar had famously lived the same humble lifestyle as caliph as he had before his coronation, sleeping on a bed of palm leaves and taking part in the same labors as his subjects in service of the needy. Under Uthman, however, the nepotistic clan politics of the pre-Islamic past began to return to the fore. Relatives of Uthman were frequently granted positions of wealth and authority, with his first foster brother Walid ibn Uqba and later his uncle Sayyid ibn As being given governorship of Kufa. And while few could accuse Abdullah ibn Sa'ad of incompetence after his conquests in North Africa and victories at sea in the Mediterranean, the fact he had replaced Amr ibn al-As, Egypt's conqueror and previous governor, largely by virtue of being another of Uthman's foster brothers, did much to stir discontent among other companions of the Prophet and long-serving Muslims of Medina, who saw themselves being denied advancement in favor of Uthman's Umayyad clan. Thanks to these and several other Umayyads appointed to prominent positions, the clan swiftly grew to become one of the most powerful political entities within the caliphate, with governors of numerous far-flung provinces tied by family bonds and ready to resist any threat to the power they shared. The most prominent figure in this narrative, however, is Uthman's cousin Muawiyah, a minor regional governor during Umar's reign, who Uthman granted lordship of all Syria. It had been on Muawiyah's suggestion that Uthman had ordered the caliphate's navy built, and its raids on Cyprus, Rhodes and Crete brought significant wealth pouring into Syria's coffers, making Muawiyah the most powerful out of a powerful family and the most likely rival to Ali in the wake of Uthman's killing. Conflict between Muawiyah and Ali had long been an inevitability, as one of the first actions Ali had taken after his election as caliph had been to order Muawiyah and many of Uthman's other appointed governors deposed. Muawiyah alone had been sufficiently powerful and secure in his position to refuse the order, and those governors that had been successfully deposed had flocked to back Muawiyah with whatever wealth or support they could offer. Confident in his power, Muawiyah had publicly rebuked Ali over Uthman's murder and tacitly claimed the caliphate as the murdered caliph's next of kin, effectively a declaration of war. Muawiyah's position was further strengthened by an unlikely ally, Amr ibn al-As, the conqueror and former governor of Egypt. Despite Amr's previous enmity towards Uthman, his popularity in Egypt made him a perfect candidate to tear the richest province in the caliphate out of Ali's hands. With Amr promised lifetime governorship of Egypt in exchange for his support, Muawiyah removed Egypt's current governor, Qais ibn Sa'd, through a masterful piece of deceit. He forged a letter from Qais to himself, agreeing to join his cause, and ensured Ali's spies learned of it. Deceived by this forgery, Ali deposed the competent and by most accounts loyal governor shortly after, with the inexperienced Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr taking his place, too late to muster significant Egyptian support for Ali in the battle to come. Amr also helped Muawiyah forge an important alliance with the most powerful tribe of Yemen, the Himyar, who had once ruled a powerful independent kingdom in pre-Islamic times. With Amr as his closest advisor, allies across the caliphate rallying to his banner, and Ali weakened by Aisha's recent rebellion, Muawiyah was in an incredibly secure position. Thus, when Caliph Ali departed Medina in late May 657 with his armies behind him to depose the recalcitrant governor, he would have a far tougher fight ahead of him than he perhaps expected. Before the two main armies met in battle, a series of cavalry pursuits and skirmishes took place at Harin and Raqqa, pitting Malik al-Ashtar against Abd al-Rahman ibn Khalid, son of the unrivaled Khalid ibn al-Walid, as Ali's army tested Muawiyah's strength and resolve and found both unbending. The first true struggle would take place at Siffin on the banks of the Euphrates River. When Ali's army arrived on June 5th, they found Syrian cavalry blocking them from reaching the only accessible watering area for miles. This was against the advice of Amr and proved to be a blunder on Muawiyah's part. When rallying his armies for the campaign against Muawiyah, Ali had found it difficult to motivate his men. Many were reluctant to see so much more bloodshed between brothers in faith to bring a governor back into the fold. But Muawiyah's ill-advised attempt to deny his foes water in the desert heat lost him any sympathy he or his forces might have enjoyed in Ali's ranks, and set the stage for a vastly bloodier confrontation than had stained the sands at Basra. The numbers involved are a matter of debate. Al-Tabari puts Ali's army at 70,000, a likely inflated number, given that it counts more than 60,000 Kufans under his banner, while al-Hassan had only been able to raise a tenth of that number for the Battle of the Camel. But even taking a more conservative estimate of 20 to 30,000 for Ali, with Muawiyah's army slightly larger, the Battle of Siffin was one of the largest and most impactful battles of Islamic history, and played out in a number of phases over the weeks to follow. Upon finding the accessible water blocked, Ali's advance guard, led by al-Ash'ath ibn Qays, fell upon the Syrian force blocking their path with a vengeance, driving them back and securing the water for the thirsty army behind them. Following the Day of the Euphrates, as this small victory was known, the armies stood for 2 days of tense standoff and failed negotiation, followed by more than a week of daily raiding and personal duels between noble commanders, lasting until June 18th, each army testing the other's mettle but reluctant to commit its full strength. June 19th saw a new ceasefire agreement forged, lasting more than a month, in a last attempt to reach a peaceful agreement, or at least convince opposing leaders to defect. But these overtures were no more successful than the previous ones. Envoys went back and forth for weeks between the two armies with messages and bribes, but the stalemate remained largely unchanged. Finally, on July 26th, the two armies met in a battle that would last 3 days and 3 nights nearly unbroken. The first day of the battle was inconclusive, mostly consisting of exchanges of arrows and cavalry raids, with casualties mounting, but neither side gaining an overwhelming advantage. The second day saw Muawiyah come very close to routing Ali, with Habib ibn Maslama leading a massive attack that drove Ali's right wing to flight and pushed hard against his centre, driving his army into disarray before reinforcements led by Malik al-Ashtar could halt the Syrian advance. Abdullah ibn Budayl, who had been in command of Ali's right, attempted to press their momentary advantage by bringing his cavalry in a charge towards Muawiyah's tent, only to be surrounded and killed by Muawiyah's elite forces. Also killed was Ammar ibn Yasir, whose presence had so frightened Zubayr in the Battle of Camel, fulfilling, according to the hadith, the supposed claim of the Prophet that Ammar would die at the hands of a wicked band of men. The third day saw Muawiyah redouble his efforts to break Ali's right wing, sending his Himyarite allies against it under the leadership of Ubayd Allah ibn Umar, the disgraced son of Caliph Umar, whose name had been tarnished by an unlawful honour killing, but whose parentage nevertheless made him a useful political prop for the would-be Caliph Muawiyah. This time, however, Ali's right held firm, killing both Ubayd Allah and Chief Dul Qalar of the Himyar and inflicting terrible casualties. As the day drew on, the two armies were finally drawn into a general melee, the duels, maneuvers and archery exchanges that had defined the previous days giving way to a confused clash of swords and lances that continued through much of the night. As morning approached, after the bloodiest night of the civil war, Ali's army appeared to have the upper hand, having driven Muawiyah's forces back and even forced him to relocate his tent to a safer location after another charge on his camp. But it would not, in the end, be strength of arms that decided the battle's outcome. As morning arrived, a number of envoys from Muawiyah rode between the armies, Qurans on their lances as a flag of truce, appealing to Ali to allow binding arbitration to settle his and Muawiyah's dispute. Though Ali held the advantage in battle, many of his soldiers, exhausted after the long battle and reluctant to continue fighting their brothers in faith, felt the offer provided an honourable alternative to further fighting, and ignored the encouragement of Malik al-Ashtar and others to continue fighting. His hands tied, Ali accepted Muawiyah's truce and call for arbitration, bringing an end to the battle. While he had been on the verge of winning the war, Caliph Ali now stood on the brink of losing everything in the peace to follow. Each side nominated an arbitrator, Amr ibn al-As for Muawiyah, and strangely deposed Kufan governor Abu Musa al-Ash'ari for Ali, who despite his personal enmity with Ali, was a popular choice among Ali's largely Kufan army. The two armies departed the battlefield, with agreements for the two arbitrators to meet over the coming months, to judge the murder of Uthman and rightful Caliph fairly, with the Quran as their guide. However, a portion of Ali's supporters staunchly opposed the arbitration, seeing it as a betrayal of God to put the decision in the hands of fallible humans rather than allowing God to pick a victor on the battlefield. Before Abu Musa departed for the first round of arbitration, two of Ali's followers, Zura ibn al-Burj and Hurqus ibn Zuhayr, confronted Ali, demanding he abandon the negotiations and return to war with Muawiyah. Ali rebuked them, claiming that he would have preferred to fight on at Siffin, but was now bound to honour the covenant he had reached. Unsatisfied, they took up the slogan, "Authority belongs to God alone," with new adherents converting to their viewpoint over the months to follow. Following the return of Ali's forces to Kufa, these al-Khawarij, or Kharijites as they would later be called, would prove a major thorn in Ali's side, heckling and criticising him as he led the prayers from the mosque and declaring both Ali and Muawiyah unfit to rule. As this discontentment grew, the two arbitrators met twice over the year that followed, both times for weeks on end, finally returning a verdict in Muawiyah's favour, ordering Ali deposed as Caliph in April of 658. Ali refused to abide by the decision, declaring it a political attack rather than a true religious judgment, but the decision greatly damaged his legitimacy and weakened his position in the ongoing Cold War against Muawiyah. Meanwhile in Kufa, the Kharijite movement was developing from a mere vocal opposition into a new rebellion, with Abdallah ibn Wahb taking command of the movement. Departing Kufa in small groups to avoid detection, Ibn Wahb regrouped his forces by the bridge crossing the Nahrawan, a great canal drawing water from the Tigris River northeast of Al-Madain. Meanwhile, other bands of Kharijite sympathizers across Iraq, having received secret letters from the leadership in Kufa, departed their homes to join Ibn Wahb's band, with savage fighting breaking out near Basra between loyalists to Ali and a band of 500 departing Kharijites. It seems Ibn Wahb intended to continue marching once his forces had assembled, to conquer Al-Madain or carve out an independent power base among the Zagros mountains. However, after compelling his remaining supporters to reaffirm their oaths of loyalty to him, Ali was quick to depart Kufa in pursuit of the Kharijites, arriving at Nahrawan in July 658. Despite their treachery, Ali attempted to avoid battle, pointing out that he now stood poised to return to war with Muawiyah as they had wished, and requesting they return to his cause. Some did, but a majority of the roughly 2,000 rebels remained stubbornly entrenched, leading to some disagreement within Ali's ranks. Many of his followers felt the Kharijites were a minor problem and should simply be ignored until after Muawiyah's defeat. But after several local villagers were slain by Kharijites, Ali's reaction would be swift, with his much larger army engaging the Kharijites on July 17th. Zealously devoted to their cause, the Kharijites did not falter, but now with less than 2,000 facing 14,000, the outcome could be in little doubt. Ali's horsemen formed up his front line, under the command of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, with archers and footmen lined up between them. When the Kharijites charged, Ali's horsemen split into two groups down the middle and rushed off to the left and right, allowing the archers to shower the onrushing Kharijites with arrows as the horsemen wheeled about and fell on their flanks. After a short, bloody, and largely one-sided confrontation, the rebel army was broken. Little of the mercy Ali had shown Aisha's rebels after the Battle of the Camel would be forthcoming, and the majority of the Kharijites to take the field would perish. The Battle of Nahrawan was a decisive victory for Ali, but also a hollow one, with the embattled Caliph forced to put his own former followers to the sword as Muawiyah grew ever more powerful. The following 2.5 years of uneasy truce saw Muawiyah take great strides, toppling Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr in Egypt and rewarding Amr ibn al-As's loyalty by returning him to power as promised, while also securing new alliances across the caliphate, many now seeing him as the legitimate caliph. By the beginning of 661, after receiving the counsel of his remaining supporters, Ali decided to embark on a second invasion of Syria while he still had the strength to challenge Muawiyah, embarking his forces in preparation for another campaign. The planned offensive would never take place, however. Meeting in Mecca, 3 Kharijite conspirators made a pact to assassinate the 3 men they viewed as responsible for the civil war: Ali, Muawiyah, and Amr. 2 of the 3 assassination attempts failed, but on January 28th, as Ali sat praying in the great mosque of Kufa, the 3rd assassin, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muljam, struck him from behind with a poisoned sword, mortally wounding the caliph and avenging his comrades fallen at Nahrawan. With Ali dead, few remained who could deny Muawiyah the caliphate. Ali's eldest son, al-Hasan, was pressured into surrendering his claim to the throne, and Muawiyah took power nearly unopposed. Beyond the simple change in leadership, the First Fitna, as the civil war came to be known, would have a massive impact on Islam's history. It split a religious and cultural movement that, united, had conquered mighty empires. Even today, the divisions between the major sects of Islam can still be traced to the First Fitna and the death of Ali. Ali's closest supporters denied the legitimacy of Muawiyah and his successors, elevating Ali and his family line to the role of divinely inspired imams. Known as the Party of Ali or Shi'at Ali, their movement remains strong today as Shia Islam, now divided into sects of its own. The majority of Muslims, accepting Muawiyah's ascension, are known as Sunni, hearkening to the Sunnah, the traditions and examples derived from the Prophet. Spreading and taking hold in North Africa, the Kharijites remained a maligned, antagonistic force, often in conflict with their fellow Muslims and what they saw as corrupt, illegitimate caliphs. Though their sect remained small, it would be at the heart of numerous uprisings and rebellions during the Umayyad period and in the following centuries as well. It was from within their ranks, though, that the more moderate and neutralist Abadi community would arise, a faith now dominant in Oman. The nature of leadership in the caliphate would be forever changed as well, with the elections that had chosen the first 4 caliphs giving way to dynastic succession. Power would remain within the Umayyad clan for the following 90 years, marking the end of the Rashidun Caliphate. During the early years of the Umayyad Caliphate, the reigning emperor in Constantinople was Constans II, who faced an increasingly dire situation on numerous fronts. In 655, he had commanded the fleet that met disaster at the Battle of the Masts, only narrowly escaping with his own life. Uthman's murder and the beginnings of the First Fitna the following year might have seemed like an opportunity for Constans to avenge his previous defeats against a divided foe. But Constans's attention was primarily turned to the west, where the Slavs and Lombards threatened Byzantine holdings in Greece and southern Italy. Not only did these European threats prevent him from taking advantage of the Islamic civil war, but they also necessitated a rise in taxes in provinces such as Sicily and North Africa, and seizures of church assets in Italy, sparking discontent and resentment towards Constans among both the provincial populations and the court in Constantinople. This political turmoil was worsened by another sort of conflict in the capital, a growing religious schism dating back to the reign of Heraclius. Efforts to reconcile differences between the Armenian and Greek orthodoxies led to the creation of the Monothelite movement. A sort of religious compromise followed, which failed to sway the majority of the Byzantine populace. By Constance's reign, this movement, that had been intended to reconcile Armenian and Greek religious divides, had simply created new divides within the capital, with Constance's attempt to quell the schism by banning all discussion of the controversy, even forcing Pope Martin I into exile after his condemnation of monothelitism, only creating new enemies for the embattled emperor. In 663, 2 years after the end of the First Fitna and the renewal of Arab attacks into Anatolia, Constans abandoned Constantinople and its hostile court and moved the Byzantine capital to Syracuse in Sicily. Unfortunately, the move would not long forestall his downfall. After relocating the capital, Constans moved into Italy with all the forces the empire could muster, in hopes of defeating the Lombards and securing southern Italy. His efforts were foiled at every turn, however, with the Lombards defeating him in a series of battles and forcing him to withdraw in shame back to Syracuse, while his son and co-emperor Constantine IV kept order in Constantinople. His legitimacy tarnished, he was unable to prevent Armenia from falling back into Arab suzerainty, and despite its prominence as the seat of the Byzantine Empire, Sicily would suffer a devastating naval raid in 666, led by Abdullah ibn Qais, that saw huge amounts of plunder enriching Muawiyah in Damascus. Caliph Muawiyah, a veteran of the Battle of the Masts himself, and a staunch enemy of the Byzantines, was now making increasingly aggressive moves at sea with his expanded navy, with similar raids carried out on roads, while Arab fleets secured naval bases along Asia Minor's Mediterranean coast in preparation for a planned siege of Constantinople. Even among Constance's own subjects, he faced danger at every turn, and in 667 he was forced to contend with an Umayyad-backed rebellion by the turncoat Armenian general and would-be emperor Saborios, that briefly took control of much of Anatolia. The rebellion would soon come to naught after Saborius' accidental death in a riding mishap shortly before the battle near Hexapolis. But this would not be the end of Constance's woes, as Fadala ibn Ubayyad, an experienced Muslim general who had briefly operated as a liaison and ally to Saborius, soon laid siege to Constantinople's Anatolian suburb of Chalcedon. Although they succeeded in capturing many prisoners, a lack of supplies and support caused this first siege attempt to flounder. In their original plan, they would have been operating in territory under the sway of their rebel ally, able to rely on local supply routes and bolstered by Saborius' own forces. Forced to operate alone in hostile territory, disease and hunger soon set in, and the army was forced to withdraw, with even the arrival of reinforcements under Muawiyah's son Yazid failing to turn the tide. It does appear that the initial Arab intention was to return to besiege Constantinople proper the following year, as a sizable garrison, 5,000 according to Theophanes the Confessor, was left behind in the captured fortress of Amorion to provide a forward base for a later attack. However, Amorion would be recaptured during the bitterly cold winter that followed, with a eunuch chamberlain named Andrew leading a force through the heavy snows that regained control of the fortress and put its garrison to the sword, delaying the planned attack on Constantinople and denying the Arabs their first major inland foothold in western Anatolia. This small victory was to be Constance's last, however, with the emperor not long outliving his would-be usurper. Constans II was struck on the head with a bucket and assassinated by one of his servants as he took his bath early in 668, with further rebellion breaking out in Sicily as the conspirators in his murder acclaimed General Mezesius their emperor in opposition to Constantine IV. The young Constantine would thus be forced to confront both the rebels in Sicily and the still looming Arab attack on Constantinople in the first years of his solo reign. Of these two challenges, the rebellion of Mezesius would be the swiftest dealt with, though it would still leave the empire weakened in ways that would soon cause further disaster. Constantine called up troops from the embattled frontiers of North Africa and Italy, bringing an end to the rebellion in Sicily after 7 months and ending its brief heyday as the empire's capital. With Constance's murder and Mazacius's acclamation so closely tied to the ongoing religious schism, the general failed to command widespread support in Sicily beyond the soldiers under his command or rally supporters beyond the island's shores. By the account of Theophanes the Confessor, even Mazacius himself had not wished to become emperor and had been chosen as a figurehead leader against his will on account of his good looks. But however easily the rebellion might have been suppressed, the recalling of soldiers from North Africa did leave the Byzantine forces in Carthage far less able to resist the pressure of the Arabs in Tripoli, creating an opportunity for the conquest of the Maghreb, stalled since before the First Fitna, to resume. 668 and 669 saw renewed Arab raids capture many thousands of prisoners from the remaining Byzantine territories in modern Tunisia, as the uneasy stalemate the two sides and their respective Berber allies had settled into broke down, with the continuing Arab presence in Anatolia further distracting the overstretched Byzantines from the defense of their frontier provinces. Meanwhile, despite Muawiyah's western focus and enmity towards the Byzantines, smaller conquests still continued apace along the former frontiers of the Sassanid Empire. In 670, Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra conquered Kabul and took at least nominal control of all of Khorasan, one of the only regions formerly under Persian domination to have remained outside of Arab control. And despite some staunch resistance from Turkic hill tribes that nearly saw one force surrounded and wiped out during its return to Kabul, he also successfully penetrated the Khyber Pass to begin the first inland conquests into modern Pakistan, previous Muslim incursions into the Indian subcontinent having been limited to the more easily traversed coastal lowlands. Politically, some unrest still continued to flare up, as Muawiyah attempted to crack down on lingering support for Ali, with the respected general Hujr ibn Adi and several of his compatriots being executed for refusing to denounce the deceased caliph, an act shocking to most. Still, the next major prize for the largely unified caliphate, and the single-minded focus that would define Muawiyah's later years as caliph, was Constantinople, with the campaign to take it beginning in earnest in 672. A massive Umayyad fleet was outfitted and launched, wintering in the naval bases prepared in Smyrna and Cilicia, while the Byzantines hurriedly constructed great biremes and dromons for the city's defense, equipped with a new and deadly anti-ship weapon, Greek fire. With the coming of spring, the fleet embarked for Constantinople, clashing almost daily with Byzantine ships in the waters just south of the Dardanelles from April until September. Compared to the Battle of the Masts, which saw the Arab fleet score victory in a pitched battle between two massed fleets, the presence of Greek fire would have made any full fleet-on-fleet engagement near suicidal for the Arabs, despite the greater size of their navy, leaving it infeasible for the Umayyad fleet to attempt to break through the Dardanelles, or bring its full force to bear against Constantinople. Under the command of Yazid, Umayyad armies were ferried to land to surround the city, but a lack of effective naval support made overcoming the city's formidable defences a truly daunting task. Though Arab forces under Yazid, Fadala and Abdallah ibn Qais did see success in various skirmishes in the surrounding region and in Crete, and were able to honour the passing of the venerable commander Abu Ayyub al-Ansari by pushing to the Theodosian walls themselves to bury him at their base. For 5 full years, the campaigning of the Umayyads failed to break through the Dardanelles and cut off Constantinople from supplies, while the Greek fire-equipped ships inflicted mounting casualties with every engagement. Finally, 10 years into Constantine's tumultuous reign in 678, flagging morale and a large rebellion of Mardaite Christians and escaped slaves in the Nur mountain range north of Alexandria forced Muawiyah to abandon the campaign, the greatest military disaster the seemingly unstoppable caliphate had suffered since it had first exploded onto the world stage some 4 decades prior. Yet the successful defense did little to change the overall balance of power, with the struggling Romans still on the defensive against the still expanding Arabs. The following years would give a much needed, if brief, reprieve to the Byzantines, as Caliph Muawiyah's death in 680 was swiftly followed by a new period of turmoil and civil war. At the center of the new conflict was Muawiyah's attempt to secure the succession of his son Yazid, when caliphs had been chosen by election prior to his reign. Yazid was indeed acclaimed as caliph in Medina, but when the governors and notables of the caliphate were summoned to give him their oaths of allegiance, two important figures refused to swear the oath: Hussein ibn Ali, son of Caliph Ali, and Abdullah ibn Zubayr, son of the Zubayr who had opposed Ali at the Battle of the Camel some 24 years prior. Despite the rivalry of their fathers, the two men were united in their opposition to Yazid and fled from Medina to Mecca to raise a rebellion against him. Offers of support soon arrived from Ali's former power base of Kufa, giving Hussein hope his murdered father's cause could be revived. A cousin of Hussein's, Muslim ibn Aqil, was sent to Kufa ahead of Hussein and his party to determine the strength of their support in Kufa, and out of suspicion the offers might be a trap by Yazid or a local notable attempting to curry his favor. Upon his arrival, he found the offers of support genuine, and as many as 12,000 flocked to Muslim's side to pledge their loyalty to Hussein. Upon receiving this news, Hussein departed Mecca to join his cousin in Kufa, a journey he would never complete. Despite his recent rocky succession to the throne, Caliph Yazid was determined to stamp out the rebellion before it could grow to challenge him, and upon learning that Kufa's governor, Nu'man ibn Bashir, had chosen to remain neutral and allow Hussein's supporters to gather, swiftly took matters into his own hands. Nu'man was transferred to a different province, with Yazid's loyal supporter Ubaydallah ibn Ziyad replacing him and initiating a harsh crackdown on the growing rebel band, with Muslim ibn Aqil and several of its other leaders being murdered and the demoralized rebels being scattered under intense pressure from local military forces. By the time Hussein received word of this disaster, he was already near today's Rifai, far from the safety of Mecca, with only a few supporters around him in increasingly hostile territory. Hussein might still have turned back and returned to Mecca at this point, but opinions among his supporters were divided, with some of his tribal supporters offering him sanctuary in the mountains of northern Najd, while many in his own family encouraged him to continue to Kufa and avenge his murdered cousin. Eventually, Hussein took the latter decision, and though many of his supporters deserted him, his march towards Kufa continued. Soon, at the plains of Karbala, his tiny band of supporters was chased down by Ubaydallah's army. Hussein requested to be allowed to return to Mecca, while Ubaydallah demanded Hussein surrender and pledge his loyalty to Yazid. When Hussein refused, the Umayyad forces surrounded Hussein's party, cutting them off from the water to force their surrender. When this too failed, the surrounding army attacked on October 10, 680, killing Hussein and his supporters in a hopelessly unequal struggle. The battle had been short, and its outcome little in doubt, but the killing of Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, would shock the Muslim world, with the date of the battle immortalized by Shia Muslims as a day of mourning and Karbala as a pilgrimage site. Galvanized by Hussein's martyrdom, major revolts led by Abdullah would arise in Mecca and Medina in the following years, with Yazid's experienced Syrian forces under Muslim ibn Uqba inflicting defeats on the rebels, but failing to regain the loyalty of the populace. The siege and bombardment of the holy city of Mecca itself in 683 only created further outrage, with Yazid dying the same year under unexplained circumstances. His son and successor, the sickly Muawiyah II, would rule only a few months before abdicating, leaving an empty throne and a caliphate divided once more, ushering in the Second Fitna. The years to follow would see numerous figures claim the caliphate. In the Hejaz, Abdullah ibn Zubayr was acclaimed caliph, with a majority of the Muslim world initially backing him. Ubaydallah ibn Ziyad, the general who had martyred Hussein at Karbala, established a power base in Basra and briefly claimed the caliphate as well, but failed to win the same widespread support, and was soon driven from Basra by an uprising of Kharijites. And in Syria, the only region still loyal to the Umayyad dynasty, Muawiyah II was eventually succeeded by Marwan, Caliph Uthman's secretary and cousin, with Yazid's young but popular son Khalid being sidelined. Ubaydallah would return to Umayyad service after the failure of his own bid for power, seizing 8 million dirhams from Basra's treasury before he fled, and would lead Marwan's armies in the coming struggle. Marwan's first challenge in defeating the more popular Abdullah was to secure his hold over Syria against a powerful foe uncomfortably close to home, Dahak ibn Qais, the governor of Damascus province, who had loyally served Muawiyah during the First Fitna, even leading his infantry at Siffin, but had now defected to Abdullah in opposition to the Umayyads, bringing much of Syria with him. Marwan did have several major advantages, though some fighting broke out in the streets after Dahak and the young Umayyad prince, Khalid ibn Yazid, each delivered speeches in favor of their faction during the leading of prayers. The Umayyads retained control of the city of Damascus itself, and by extension, the vast treasury of the caliphate, allowing Marwan to win the loyalty of many local tribes through bribery. Dahak also retained some degree of loyalty to the dynasty he'd served so long, even briefly returning to Umayyad service after negotiating with Khalid and Ubaydallah, making him a rather reluctant and indecisive opponent, spurred on only by pressure from his overwhelmingly anti-Umayyad supporters in the Qaisi tribal confederation. Even so, Dahak and the Qaisi were able to amass a sizable army of 20,000 or more at Marj Rahit, at the edge of the desert to the east of Damascus, joined by supporters from across Syria. Marwan, on the advice of Ubaydallah, gathered his own loyalists from the Kalb Confederation and from the remnants of the once powerful Ghassanids and rode out to challenge him, with the two armies meeting on July 29, 684. With his own supporters numbering some 6,000, Marwan was outnumbered greatly by Dahak's forces. Nevertheless, his infantry-heavy army was able to hold firm over the course of 19 days of raiding and skirmishing from Dahak's largely mounted force. Marwan's left was commanded by Ubaydallah, and his right by Amr ibn Sa'id, also known as al-Ashdaq, an Umayyad clansman whose ambitions would lead him to attempt his own grab for the throne in the years following. Dahak gave command of his right to Zayd ibn Amr, with other notable commanders including Thawa ibn Man of the Banu Sulaym, on whose insistence Dahak had finally broken from the Umayyads. On August 18th, the fighting grew fiercer and the skirmishing gave way to charges and hand-to-hand combat. Despite coming from so many disparate groups, the morale and discipline of Marwan's forces won out, with his hard-pressed infantry weathering numerous disorganized attacks until a mighty champion from among the Kalb, named Zuna ibn Abdallah, slew Dahak in the midst of a heated melee. Neither side at first realized the governor had fallen, with Zuna throwing himself back into the fray, unaware of the victory he had won. But another soldier, marveling at the warrior's prowess, soon discovered Dahak's body and returned his head to Marwan. Despite still holding a numerical advantage, the Abdullah loyalists quickly dissolved after their leader's defeat, the cavalry of the various tribes under Dahak's banner melting away and returning home or swearing obedience to Marwan. Many battles still lay ahead for the Umayyads, even with Syria now firmly in their grasp. Most of the caliphate still recognized Abdullah as caliph, and as the Second Fitna drew on, more factions and challenges would arise to complicate the struggle for the throne. But with his victory at Marj Rahit, Marwan had rescued his dynasty from the edge of total defeat, and with the armies of Syria and the treasury of the caliphate behind him, he now stood poised to reclaim the empire Yazid had lost. In many cases throughout the empire, local notables had nominally sworn loyalty to Ibn al-Zubayr while remaining functionally neutral, using the breakdown of authority to avoid Umayyad taxation. In others, Zubayrid authority was reliant on unsteady alliances with Kharijites and Shiites, and though these groups might have made common cause with Ibn al-Zubayr at first in order to topple the Umayyads, an alliance with the Kharijites would never be a lasting one unless he adopted their beliefs, alienating his other supporters in the process, and the Shia refused to name him caliph, seeking for a descendant of the murdered Caliph Ali to take his place on the throne. Thus, while Marwan controlled a secure Syrian power base and the caliphate's treasury, Ibn al-Zubayr struggled to create a united front amongst his supporters, leaving the Umayyads stronger and the Zubayrids weaker than their lopsided territorial control would suggest. Indeed, shortly after the Umayyad victory in the Battle of Marj Rahit, Marwan was able to take Egypt largely unopposed, with his clansman Amr ibn Sa'id entering Fustat and rallying its population back to the Umayyad cause, while Marwan stood in standoff with Egypt's Zubayrid governor Abd al-Rahman ibn Jadam outside the city, a major step towards reunifying the caliphate and a sign of Ibn al-Zubayr's hollow authority. Meanwhile, other outbreaks of civil strife were occurring across the caliphate, most prominently in the Khorasan region, with Abd Allah ibn Qasim having never been appointed to governor by any caliph, instead forcing out Umayyad governor Salm ibn Ziyad thanks to anti-Umayyad sentiments among the army. The power vacuum allowed numerous local communities and factions within the army to drive out officials and seize control across Khorasan. However, Ibn Qasim's effectiveness and brutality in suppressing both rebels and opportunistic Hephthalite raiders, reportedly ordering his forces to execute prisoners until the sun set after one victory, quickly ended any opposition, allowing him to rule with little regard for either faction during the following years of civil war. And in Kufa, a militant Shiite movement known as the Al-Tawabin or Penitents was gathering steam. While the death of al-Hussein had caused shock and outrage across the entire Muslim community, the impact had been greatest among the Shia community of Kufa, whose support Hussein had been travelling to enlist, with many seeking either vengeance or martyrdom to compensate for failing to aid him. With the outbreak of the Second Fitna, propagandists were sent to garrison towns across Kufa, calling for vengeance and the turnover of power to the family of the Prophet. The movement began to split, however, with the arrival of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi on May 7, 684. Mukhtar claimed to be a follower of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, a son of Caliph Ali through a different wife than the Prophet's daughter Fatima. Al-Mukhtar's claims that Ibn al-Hanafiyyah was the promised Mahdi or the guided one, and the prospect of serving an heir to Ali, served to sway a portion of the penitents away from their leader Sulayman ibn Surad and create a bitter divide. When the Zubayrid governor Abdallah ibn Yazid arrived on May 15th, it was all he could do to prevent violence breaking out between the two factions or against their erstwhile Zubayrid allies. Further weakening Ibn al-Zubayr, his Kharijite allies in Mecca deserted him during this same period. Tiring of al-Zubayr's vague claims of ideological support, they relocated to Basra and the Al-Yamama region to raise a rebellion of their own under the leadership of Abu Talut. They would remain a major thorn in the side of the Zubayrids, even conquering much of the Arabian Peninsula in the coming years. Of all these groups, the first to engage in a major campaign would be Sulayman ibn Surad's penitents, who began their long-awaited invasion of Syria on November 15, 684. However, despite the lingering grief over Hussein's death and years of propaganda work, Sulayman was greatly disappointed by the turnout when his call to arms finally came, with only 5,000 out of 16,000 whose support had been promised materializing, and many of these deserting in the coming months. Nonetheless, despite Abdallah ibn Yazid's attempts to convince them to remain in Kufa in unity with the Zubayrids, he wasted no time in departing, leaving Kufa on the 17th, first to Hussein's tomb at Karbala for a day and night of mourning, and then on to al-Qadisiyyah. Here they were provided supplies and information by the sympathetic Qaysid chieftain Zufar ibn al-Harith, one of the Zubayrid commanders during the disaster at Marj Rahit. The Umayyad army, returning from the subjugation of Egypt, had recently left Raqqa and was marching towards the town of Ain al-Warda on their way to invade Iraq. Informed of their whereabouts by Zufar, and enjoying superior mobility with his mounted army, Sulayman made haste to reach the site before his foes. arriving 5 days before the Umayyads and camping to the west of the city in order to cut them off from food and water. Having reinforced in Egypt and numbering close to 20,000, the Umayyad army held an advantage in numbers, but was divided against itself. While Ubaydallah ibn Ziyad was in overall command of the army, he was not present during its march through what was thought to be friendly territory, leaving 2 of his commanders, al-Husayn ibn Numayr and ibn Di al-Kala, to squabble over leadership, travelling and camping separately as they marched unknowingly towards the penitents' ambush. When they arrived at the beginning of January 685, it was Ibn Di al-Kala's smaller contingent that first saw battle, with the penitents being led to his camp by a local Bedouin and launching a surprise attack. Though outnumbered, surprise and confusion allowed Sulayman's charging horsemen to put al-Kala's forces to rout, with many being run down and slain and their camp abandoned to be looted. This initial engagement would do little to even the odds, however, and Ibn Numayr was sent with a larger force of 12,000 on January 4th. During a brief standoff before the battle, the demands of each side were conveyed, with the penitents demanding Ibn Ziyad be turned over to them for his role in Husayn's death, and the Umayyads demanding Sulayman swear fealty to Marwan. But these demands were little more than formality, the 2 armies coming together in battle after their refusal. The penitents put their mobility to good use, following advice from Zufar, reinforcing or withdrawing contingents as they came under attack, rather than confront the larger Umayyad force head-on. Both commanders led their respective centres, with elements of Sulayman's horsemen dismounting to support their comrades from the ground where the fighting was thickest. This skirmishing was won by the penitents in the short term, though not without losses, and Ibn Numayr's forces withdrew in good order to regroup with those of Ibn Di al-Kala. Now reunited, with Ibn Ziyad chastising al-Kala for his earlier defeat and stripping him of command to end the feud, the Umayyad army now stood poised to bring their full numbers to bear, leading to a day of bloody fighting on the 5th that took a heavy toll on the already outnumbered Shia. When fighting resumed on the 6th, the exhausted penitents soon found themselves pressed from all sides, unable to prevent the Umayyads from flanking and surrounding their separated cavalry contingents. The same tactics that had previously enabled them to avoid the full weight of Umayyad numbers, now allowing them to be defeated piecemeal. Sulayman ibn Sarad and several of his close companions were slain by punishing volleys of arrows, with a series of spirited charges by Sulayman's second-in-command, al-Musayyab ibn Najaba, and the late arrival of reinforcements from Basra doing nothing to turn the tide. The destruction of the penitent cause brought the Umayyads one step closer to recovering their caliphate, though Marwan would not long outlive it, dying in the spring of 685, either by plague or assassination carried out by his queen, depending on which accounts you believe. He was succeeded by his son Abd al-Malik. Ain al-Warda did not mark the end of Shia participation in the Second Fitna, however. With their leaders dead, survivors from Sulayman's movement turned to Muqta al-Thaqafi, who had been growing in power in Iraq by appealing to traditionally disadvantaged non-Arab converts. Though he continued to characterize himself as a mere follower of Ibn al-Hanafiyyah, their actual ties remained tenuous, with Muqta even using a falsified letter of support from his figurehead to sway local leader Ibrahim ibn al-Ashtar to back his coup, according to some accounts, and acting to isolate Ibn al-Hanafiyyah from the movement championing him. But whatever Muqta's motivations, October saw him break any remaining ties with Ibn al-Zubayr and oust his governor Abdallah ibn Muti, taking control of most of Iraq and Armenia. Further Kharijite uprisings toppled Zubayrid authority in southern Persia and Bahrain, leaving both sides of the Persian Gulf in Kharijite hands, and Ibn al-Zubayr's would-be caliphate smaller than ever. But as weakened as he may have been, he was still far from helpless, defeating both an Umayyad push on Medina under the Qudaa tribal leader Hubaysh ibn Dulja, and a Kharijite attack on Basra to secure his remaining holdings, leaving the final victor of the civil war still in doubt. The next few years would see some of the Umayyads' momentum reversed. The invasion force that had routed Sulayman's penitents made slow progress after this victory, delayed by Marwan's death and uprisings from the Qaysi tribes that had supported Dahak at Marj Rahit. When they finally launched their invasion of Iraq a year and a half later, in the summer of 686, al-Mukhtar was at something of a disadvantage, as his attempts to appease both the Arab tribal nobility and non-Arab converts, or Mawali, had fallen through and led to attempts by the tribal nobility to depose him over perceived erosion of their privileges. This conflict was further stoked by Ibn al-Zubayr's brother and governor of Basra, Musab, who courted the disgruntled Kufan nobility in an attempt to regain Iraq. The death of one of Mukhtar's commanders to plague shortly after his victory over an Umayyad probing force near Mosul sparked rumours that his army had been defeated, with an opportunistic revolt breaking out in late June. Nevertheless, the besieged Mukhtar was able to both put down this coup attempt, holding out in his palace long enough for Ibrahim ibn al-Ashtar's army to return from the Umayyad front and relieve him, and mobilize a large army of predominantly Persian-speaking Mawali and Shia partisans to confront the Umayyads, meeting them at the beginning of August, some 15 miles east of Mosul on the banks of the Qazir River. While Ziyad's army had been estimated to number as high as 80,000, this figure is far out of proportion with the same army's numbers during the Battle of Ain al-Warda or similar armies raised out of Syria, and is likely reflective of historian Abu Miknaf's anti-Umayyad leanings. Though no fully reliable figure exists, the true number was likely little higher than 30,000, even allowing for reinforcement from the remains of the failed push on Medina. Even so, the Umayyads held a definite numerical advantage over the 13,000 under Ibrahim ibn al-Ashtar, but were as weakened by division as before. The commander of their left wing, Umayr ibn al-Hubab, held a meeting with Ibrahim the night of August 5th to offer his defection in the coming battle. Following Umayyah's advice, Ibn al-Ashtar wasted no time in bringing the battle to the Umayyads the following morning, ignoring the normal protocol of raiding and skirmishing as his smaller army came crashing into their larger yet still disorganized foe. The initial stages of the battle went in the Umayyads' favor, with the Umayyad right wing under Ibn Numayr slaying the commander of Ibn al-Ashtar's right and putting them to flight. However, the fallen banner was quickly taken up by Abdullah ibn Warqa, nephew to one of the Prophet's companions, who rallied enough of the fleeing soldiers back to his side to stall the Umayyad advance. On the Umayyad left, accounts conflict on Umayyah's role, with the historian al-Kalbi claiming the promised defection never materialized and Umayyah remained loyal to Ibn Ziyad, while others hold he deserted the battlefield. As he and Ibn al-Ashtar conversed peacefully after the battle, the latter is likely closer to the truth, but either way he took a rather passive role, his inaction leaving the Umayyad center open for the Kufan right and center to launch a desperate flanking attack. Crucial in this effort was Sharik ibn Jadir al-Taglibi, a warrior who had fought under Caliph Ali in the First Fitna, whose furious cavalry charge carved open a path to Ubayd Allah ibn Ziyad and toppled the Umayyad banners. With the death of Ibn Ziyad and the continuing dissension and rivalry within the Umayyad ranks, the great army quickly dissolved, Umayyah's forces departing peacefully, while many others drowned trying to flee across the Qazir River. The short but brutal battle would delay any further Umayyad move against Iraq for several years, but do little to secure Mukhtar's unstable position, with the Zubayrids and his own tribal nobility still conspiring against him. Some months later, most likely in the late autumn of 686, Musab ibn al-Zubayr would march out of Basra for his own invasion, bolstered by exiled Kufan noble rebels. Given little time to recover, Ibn al-Ashtar's army made haste to meet them, though without the leader that had carried them to victory against the Umayyads. Ibn al-Ashtar himself, now the Zubayrid-friendly governor of Mosul, abandoned Mukhtar's cause under unclear circumstances in Qazir's aftermath, the coinciding defection of Umayyah suggesting a likely pact between the two. Amr ibn Shumayt took command, Though lacking his predecessor's experience, his army soon met with disaster just north of Basra at Madha, with resentment among the tribal nobility in both armies towards the Mawali, making up the bulk of Mukhtar's forces, coming to the fore in gruesome fashion. While non-Arabs were traditionally barred from serving as mounted warriors, Mukhtar had relaxed this rule and increased their pay to earn their support. Yet at the Battle of Madha, Ibn Shumayt once more required them to dismount and fight as foot soldiers. When Ibn Shumayt was slain and his army routed, the Kufan horsemen escaped, while huge numbers of the Mawali infantry were run down and slaughtered by the vengeful exiles, suffering a massively disproportionate death toll, with few escaping and no prisoners taken. This disaster shook faith in Mukhtar's messianic movement, and total collapse was not long in coming. The Zubayrid invasion force made haste by boat and horse towards Kufa, hastily assembling another army and attempting in vain to delay the invaders by flooding the canals along the Euphrates. Mukhtar would personally lead his army in the second desperate clash against the Zubayrids at Harura on Kufa's outskirts. Mukhtar and his forces fought bravely, with the battle initially in the balance. Muhammad ibn al-Ash'ath, leader of the Kufan exiles fighting under Musab, was slain, and the Highland Hijazi tribesmen, making up a fifth of the Basran force, fled early in the battle. However, these initial successes would be brought to naught when the Basran left wing, which, under the cautious al-Muhallab Abi Sufra, had initially held back from the fighting, swung forward, crushing and routing Kufan forces already bloodied and exhausted from almost a day's fighting. Though Mukhtar narrowly escaped, his army and hopes were destroyed, and his supporters executed en masse by the victors, with the 4-month palace siege in Kufa only dragging out the inevitable. On April 3, 687, Musab's forces stormed his palace and executed him, swiftly restoring Armenia and Iraq to the Zubayrid fold. Other than Kharajite raiding and small border confrontations, the resulting Umayyad-Zubayrid stalemate would persist for the next 4 years, with both sides exhausted by the long civil war, and no major battles between the two occurred until 691. During this time, the long-neglected frontiers saw action once more, with an Umayyad army under Zubayr ibn Qais dispatched to the mountains of Algeria, where the Byzantine-allied Berber king, Caecilius, had taken advantage of the civil war to overrun much of Ifriqiya. Defeating and killing him in 688, Zuhair retook Kairouan and re-established the caliphate as the dominant force in the region, with only the Byzantine stronghold of Carthage remaining a threat. And Abd al-Malik remained active against his Zubayrid rivals during the apparent lull as well, engaging in intrigue and diplomacy with Zubayrid supporters across the caliphate, taking advantage of Ibn al-Zubayr's weakness and the growing apathy towards his predecessor's misdeeds after nearly a decade of war to chip away at his foe's support base. Though his next attempt to invade Iraq in 689 was interrupted by his kinsman Amr ibn Sa'id's short-lived coup attempt, the end of the civil war would almost come as an anticlimax after the fierce battles of its first years, with the majority of Musab's army defecting and abandoning him to die when Abd al-Malik finally recaptured Iraq in October 691. Abd al-Malik had Musab and his son Isa buried with honor, lamenting the tragedy of the civil war, but despite his poetic words, he remained ruthless in rooting out any remaining opposition, besieging Mecca, and mopping up Abdullah ibn Zubayr's last supporters the following year. Though putting down the Kharajite rebels and independents such as Ibn Qasim would take several more years, the Umayyad Caliphate had emerged victorious against its first would-be usurper. The Second Fitna had been a long and bloody affair, marked with a further departure from the unity of the Rashidun era. Even during the First Fitna, the prospect of Muslims fighting Muslims remained a painful aberration, with concerted efforts at mediation preceding battles, and the conflict being brought into religious arbitration. But during the Second Fitna, the sectarian schisms arising out of the first, and the blood feuds that accompanied them, made violence and retribution all too easy to accept. But shaken though it might have been, the caliphate remained whole, with further victories still lying ahead in Africa, Asia, and even the unsuspecting Visigothic kingdom of Iberia. Following Ibn al-Zubayr's death and the surrender of his forces at the end of an 8-month-long siege of Mecca, the immediate aftermath of the Second Fitna would see Caliph Abd al-Malik dispatch armies to suppress the Kharijite uprisings that had been such a thorn in his would-be usurper's side. The Kharijite army ruling Yemen and Central Arabia had already begun to fragment and dissolve even before the Umayyad victory in the civil war, with their leader, Naji ibn Amir al-Hanafi, having been executed by his own disillusioned forces over his supposed secret negotiations with the Umayyads. Many of the Kharijites dispersed before the Umayyad reconquest, making for Persia or North Africa. With that said, the Kharijite remainder, led by Abu Fudayk, put up staunch resistance to General Umar ibn Ubaydallah's Iraqi army when they met in battle in Bahrain, driving back the Basrans making up the Umayyad left wing and seriously wounding Umar. However, they were held at bay by the Kufan right wing and the Syrian cavalry making up the centre, then driven back to their camp when the Basrans rallied and returned to the fray. With the wind at the Umayyads' backs, the Kharijite camp was set alight, with the smoke and heat panicking horses and reducing the Kharijite defence to chaos. With Abu Fudayk slain on the battlefield, those of his followers that remained fled to the fortress of al-Mushakka, but with no relief or reinforcement coming, the walls of the ancient fortress did little more than entrap them. Lacking supplies, surrender came swiftly, and little mercy was shown, the mass executions of most of Abu Fudayk's followers ending the brief period of Kharijite dominance in Arabia in a grisly fashion. Though Kharijites still held sway in parts of southern Persia, and would be behind further uprisings in the future, this would be their last major bid for power within the caliphate. A more serious challenge to the reunified Umayyad realm would come in the north, with the breakdown of the peace treaty with Byzantium. Under Emperor Justinian II's leadership, the Byzantines had not been entirely uninvolved in the caliphate's civil war, extorting tribute from the Umayyads and even taking control of Armenia from the Zubayrids. They also backed and supported uprisings of Christians within the divided caliphate. In the Nur Mountains, where Anatolia and the Levant meet, the Marj community had risen up along with thousands of escaped slaves in 688, launching raids into Syria and forcing the overextended Umayyads to make even greater concessions to quell a threat uncomfortably close to their seat of power. Though no major battles were fought, and it is unlikely this Byzantine involvement greatly impacted the civil war's course, Justinian II was able to secure a great deal of tribute, and more importantly, the Marjarites themselves, who were relocated to regions of southern Anatolia left depopulated by Arab raiding to help rebuild the Byzantine power base. However, while the relocation of the Marjarites was a major economic boon for the flagging Byzantine Empire, it also removed an obstacle from the path of a renewed caliphate offensive after the civil war's end. Surprisingly, despite the favourable terms of the 689 treaty, it was Justinian that broke it and made the first move, attempting to regain full control of Cyprus and its revenues after decades of shared ownership. This action could be seen as a defensively minded preemptive strike, with Justinian expecting Abd al-Malik to break it as soon as his strength was replenished. Or Justinian may have simply underestimated the caliphate's strength, hoping to secure even greater concessions after a battlefield victory. Either way, the renewal of hostilities quickly backfired for the Romans. Though precise dates are unclear, the later months of 692 saw two clashes take place: a smaller army of 4,000 invading Armenia under Uthman ibn al-Walid, and a push into Anatolia by the bulk of the remaining Umayyad armies under the Umayyad prince Muhammad ibn Marwan, a younger brother of the Caliph. Both of these clashes would end in Umayyad victory. The latter and larger battle would see Muhammad opposed by the Byzantine general Leontios and a sizable but irregular army. The bulk of the force was composed of Slavs, recently conquered and relocated by Justinian from Macedonia to Opsikion, with a sizable tribute of soldiers among the terms imposed by Justinian upon their defeat. The forced resettlement of these Slavs did little to encourage loyalty, however, and at Sebastopolis, their leader, Nebulos, spurred by generous bribes, defected to the caliphate with the majority of his soldiers. The battle that had initially seemed in Leontios' favour swiftly turned into a crushing defeat, and in short order undid the years of gains the Byzantines had made during the Caliphate's civil war. Interestingly, the greatest damage to the Byzantine Empire to come as a result of Sebastopolis was dealt not by Muhammad ibn Marwan, but by Leontios. After his defeat to Muhammad at the Cilician town of Sebastopolis, Leontios was imprisoned as punishment by Justinian, who also harshly punished the remaining loyal Slavic soldiers for the battlefield defection of their kin, selling many families into slavery. These insults did not long go unavenged though, as after Leontios was released in 695, he soon deposed Justinian through rebellion and seized power as emperor himself, setting off a period of instability that saw 6 emperors rise and fall in relatively quick succession over the next 22 years. On the home front, Abd al-Malik worked aggressively to consolidate power in former rebel strongholds. A figure of central importance during this period was al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who rose to prominence as the leader of the Caliph's personal forces, and became famous for his keen military mind. Following the Second Fitna, he was rewarded with the governorship of Yemen and the Hejaz, a major display of Abd al-Malik's trust for the general, given the lingering anti-Umayyad sentiments in the former Zubayrid power base. Though only in the position 2 years, al-Hajjaj swiftly reasserted Umayyad control through harsh, unforgiving leadership and displays of force that both helped cow the rebellious nobility of the Hejaz and allowed Abd al-Malik to demonstrate his mercy through occasional more lenient interventions. Leaving Arabia behind in 694, he was sent next to Iraq, taking over as governor of Basra and Kufa from the Umayyad prince Bashir ibn Marwan, and working to reassert control over a fractured and rebellious Persia, where he would soon find himself on the front lines of another rebellion. Meanwhile, on the western frontiers, expansion was beginning anew. While the Caliphate had been the dominant power in North Africa for decades, the continuing Byzantine presence in Carthage left their hold over the region tenuous at best. Additionally, outside of fortified cities such as the aforementioned Carthage and Kairouan, the native Berbers held effective control of most of the Maghreb, with different groups entering into alliances with either the Caliphate or Byzantines based on shared religion or political expediency. So as long as the Byzantines represented an opposing power bloc, they could forge alliances with Berber kingdoms and tribes that had not yet converted to Islam, and back native opposition to the Caliphate's expansion. To finally stamp out this threat, Abd al-Malik dispatched Hassan ibn al-Numan with 40,000 Syrian, Egyptian and converted Berber soldiers in 694 to capture Carthage. Initially, the invasion met only success, with the city's fleet and garrison abandoning Carthage for Sicily before Hassan's arrival in early 695, and allowing the city to fall without resistance. Hassan had more enemies in North Africa than he knew, however. Following the death of King Caecilius, or Kusayla, to the armies of Zubair ibn Qays, a new ruler had emerged to reunite the Berber kingdom Zuhayya had shattered. Known as Queen Dia to the Berbers, she was called Al-Kahina, the Oracle, by the Arabs, with rumors of her future sight a mark of her strategic prowess. As Dia united many Berber groups across religious lines in opposition to Hassan's advance, she entered into an alliance with Constantinople, cemented by her marriage to a Greek husband. Learning of Dia's prestige and determined to suppress Berber resistance, Hassan swiftly departed Carthage to march against her in Algeria, seemingly expecting another easy victory. Instead, when he engaged the large army Dia had raised near Bakaya, he saw the previous year's progress rapidly undone in a shocking military defeat. The precise details of the so-called Battle of Meskiana, named for the shallow river valley the two armies clashed in, are rather unclear, though it is known that even among converted Muslim Berbers, a sizable portion favoured Dia's cause, chafing at the inferior treatment non-Arab converts within the Caliphate's military received, just as the Persian converts of Iraq had during the Second Fitna. The defection of Berbers in Hassan's army before or during the battle could go some distance towards explaining the defeat of his larger and better armed force. Though whatever the cause of this disaster, the stung Hassan would abandon the campaign to await reinforcements in Tripolitania, not to challenge Dia for another 5 years. He did, however, clash once more with the Byzantines during his retreat, who, under General Absimar, had recaptured Carthage by sea in a surprise attack while Hassan had been marching against Dia. This time, Hassan took no chances. After years of Byzantine resistance and fleet activity out of the city, he chose to raze Carthage to the ground, as Scipio Africanus the Younger had centuries prior, conclusively ending the Byzantine foothold in the Maghreb and stripping Dia of a crucial ally. For his part, rather than continue the resistance in North Africa, Absimar commandeered the Carthage fleet for a voyage to Constantinople, where he overthrew Emperor Leontios and seized the throne as the new Emperor Tiberius III, compounding the internal strife and instability that had already weakened the Byzantine resistance over the past years. Accompanying these temporary setbacks in the west was a new breakout of rebellion in the east. The Hephthalite-descended Zunbil Kingdom of Afghanistan was proving a formidable roadblock to Governor al-Hajjaj's expansion attempts, and the first campaign against them in 698 ended in utter failure when Ubaydallah ibn Abi Bakr's army was lured into the heart of the mountainous kingdom, cut off from retreat, and destroyed. The greatest threat to al-Hajjaj and the Umayyads would not come from the Zunbils, though, but from the general sent to lead the second invasion, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muhammad ibn al-Ash'ath. When he attacked the Zunbils in early 700, they fell back without battle, abandoning large swaths of their territory to the invaders. Fearing the same trap that had doomed Ubaydallah's army, al-Ash'ath opted not to push on into their mountainous heartland, planning to consolidate his conquests and continue cautiously expanding over the years to follow. But when al-Hajjaj learned of this, he accused Abd al-Rahman of cowardice, demanding he complete the conquest of the Zunbils before he or any of his men would be allowed home to Iraq. Here, the harshness he had so often shown while subduing the Hijaz would backfire, as the soldiers in Abd al-Rahman's army, wary of the danger ahead and angered by their poor treatment, opted to follow Abd al-Rahman back to Iraq to depose al-Hajjaj rather than pressing on into Afghanistan as ordered. Reaching an accord with the Zunbils, promising them tribute exemption should he be victorious, in exchange for safe haven should he be defeated, he began his march west through Persia, defeating al-Hajjaj's loyal commander, Atir ibn Amr al-Anbari, in a series of cavalry engagements along the way. At this point, Abd al-Rahman's rebellion was strictly targeting al-Hajjaj, and no threats towards Abd al-Malik or claims for the title of Caliph had been made. But after receiving word of the mutiny, Abd al-Malik opted to back his unpopular governor, sending several thousand experienced Syrian cavalry with all haste to Basra to reinforce him. In a last-ditch effort to turn back the rebels, al-Hajjaj sent 2,000 of these new arrivals to block the mutineers from crossing the Dujail River in the lowlands of Khuzestan. But while they initially saw success against a 300-strong advance force, the rebel army, raised and outfitted for conquest and certainly outnumbering the Syrians, even if the reported strength of 100,000 is a clear exaggeration, soon forded the shallow river, forcing their way across and putting the Syrians to rout. In the aftermath of this clash, the rebels expanded the scope of their movement, now disavowing Abd al-Malik and seeking his overthrow, along with that of al-Hajjaj. It is possible Abd al-Rahman had intended this from the beginning, and simply used the battle as justification. But whether this was the case or not, he now represented a major threat to the overextended caliphate, with so much of Abd al-Malik's core Syrian army away fighting in North Africa. Arriving in Basra in February of 701, after al-Hajjaj had fled north towards Kufa, Abd al-Rahman took advantage of the departed governor's unpopularity to secure oaths of loyalty from much of Basra, fortifying the city and engaging in a month of skirmishing with al-Hajjaj's forces before sallying forth to do battle in mid-March. Initially, the Iraqis held the upper hand. Though the two armies met in the open, al-Hajjaj's loyal forces, drawn from the Qurayshi and Thaqif tribal confederations of the Hejaz and the Caliph's Syrian reinforcements, were soon forced to retreat to the defensive trenches they had prepared to foil the enemy's cavalry charges. Fierce fighting took place for most of the day, with the spearmen on al-Hajjaj's flanks falling back in disarray and the centre on the verge of rout. But on the very brink of defeat, an unexpected charge by Sufyan ibn al-Abrad al-Kalbi, leading the forces of Syria's powerful Kalb tribe, one of the few to remain loyal to the Umayyads at the start of the Second Fitna, impacted the Iraqis' right wing, the trench fighting breaking up formations and confusing their defense. With the pressure lessened, the Syrian and Hijazi forces rallied, splitting the Iraqi army in two and setting them to flight. Abd al-Rahman immediately retreating north with the Kufan soldiers and most of his cavalry, while one of his lesser commanders, Ibn Abd al-Muttalib, led the Basran forces in a 3-day fighting retreat before finally escaping al-Hajjaj's pursuit and taking off after his departed general. But despite this defeat and al-Hajjaj's subsequent recapture of Basra, Abd al-Rahman's mutiny was still a major concern for Caliph Abd al-Malik, especially once the people of Kufa rose up to depose al-Hajjaj's loyal overseer, Ibn al-Hadrami, and offer Abd al-Rahman their support upon his arrival. A year later, when al-Hajjaj marched north again after pacifying Basra and receiving further Syrian reinforcements, he found a greatly bolstered rebel army awaiting him outside Kufa. With both forces now wary of a decisive engagement, they each entrenched themselves on April 4, 702, with weeks of low-intensity raiding and probing attacks following. This drawn-out exchange favoured the Iraqis, who could easily resupply from Kufa, while al-Hajjaj's army struggled to feed itself in the unfriendly territory. And when word of the ongoing stalemate reached Abd al-Malik, he went as far as offering to remove al-Hajjaj in exchange for peace. Yet surprisingly, Abd al-Rahman and his companions chose to refuse this offer, his army redoubling the pressure on al-Hajjaj's trenches with daily attacks. This back-and-forth skirmishing between the trenches continued until mid-July, though the morale of the rebels began to flag after the death of their cavalry commander, Jabala ibn Zayd. With no quick victory in sight, some of Abd al-Rahman's commanders began to question the wisdom of refusing the Caliph's peace offering, with some possibly reaching out in secret to the Umayyads in hopes of receiving pardons for their defection. When the two armies finally came together again in pitched battle on July 15th, both armies held firm through the fierce fighting until midday, seemingly evenly matched. But like in the previous battle, it would be a charge by al-Kalbi that decided the outcome. Rushing out with his cavalry from behind the Syrian right wing, he attacked the Iraqi left wing under the command of al-Abrad ibn Qurra, a leader normally noted for his bravery. Here, however, Ibn Qurra fell back in retreat almost immediately, leading to unconfirmed accusations in some accounts that his desertion had been negotiated with the Umayyads before the battle. With the collapse of the left wing, many in the rebel centre began to flee as well, despite Abd al-Rahman's best efforts to rally a defence. After an impassioned call to arms from his pulpit, his commanders and some of the retreating infantry flocked to his side for a last stand, but with the tide of battle now firmly in their favour, the Umayyads simply showered him and his defenders with arrows rather than charge the well-defended trenches. With his position besieged and the battle lost, Abd al-Rahman fled east to the safety of the Zunbils, marking the end of his attempt on the caliphate. Back in the Maghreb, though seemingly unchallenged following her victory at Meskiana, Dia unwittingly planted the seeds of her own downfall by embarking on a scorched earth campaign in the territory she had driven Hassan from. Likely viewing the caliphate's renewed invasion as simply ambitious raiding, she may have hoped to dissuade them from returning by stripping the border regions of plunder, or to demoralize them further after their defeat with a display of brutality. Unfortunately, this move would quickly backfire, for many under Dia's banner, especially those who lived in the affected lands or used them for grazing, were angered by the wasteful and self-destructive action, and without the immediate unifying threat of the caliphate, Dia's Berber kingdom began to fragment. As these events are filtered through the interpretations of non-Berber outsiders, it is even possible the fragmentation had begun earlier, and what Arab observers saw as a scorched earth campaign was in reality an attempt to stamp out brewing tribal rebellion. Thus, despite her massive victory in battle, Dia would never reach Kairouan as her predecessor Caecilius had, with her dominance of the Maghreb reduced to little more than her homeland in the Auris mountain highlands by the time Hassan returned with reinforcements in late 702. Dia mustered what loyal forces remained to her, picking an advantageous battleground to await Hassan's arrival, Tabaka, on the coast north of the modern Tunisian city of Jendouba, where the Auris Mountains and Mediterranean Sea formed a natural choke point. The choice of the battlefield was sound. The terrain would constrain and hamper the numerically superior Muslim army, while the presence of the Byzantine fleet at Sicily prevented Hassan from simply bypassing the choke point by sea. Nevertheless, when the battle was joined early in 703, Dia would see first her army and then her kingdom shatter, with no more Byzantine gold to sway tribes to her banner, and with her actions having alienated most of the lowlanders. Many of those who had fought with her at Mesquiana deserted her or chose to join Hassan, now that the Caliphate was the only remaining power bloc in the region. Though she narrowly escaped the disastrous defeat, she was pursued into the Auris Mountains and slain soon after, ending the years of back-and-forth fighting to conquer the Maghreb. To aid in the rebuilding of the devastated region after Carthage's razing and Dia's scorched earth campaign, thousands of Coptic Christians were resettled from Egypt, taking up residence in newly founded Tunis to work in Hassan's new shipyards for the growing caliphate. In a cruel twist of irony though, Hassan would not get to enjoy the spoils of his great victory any longer than Dia had, as a dispute over jurisdiction with Abdulaziz ibn Marwan, governor of Egypt and brother to the caliph, ended with Hassan losing his hard-earned governorship and returning to Syria in disgrace and poverty scarcely a year later, while Abdulaziz expanded his own power on the back of Hassan's success by installing his loyal servant Musa ibn Nusayr in his place. It was Musa, not Hassan, who would push west to the Atlantic coast in the following few years, converting and assimilating most of the Berber tribes in his path, and waging war against those that refused, finally standing poised for the next great conquest of the ever-growing caliphate, Visigothic Spain. In the east, meanwhile, the unrest sparked by Abd al-Rahman's rebellion would continue for years, with his former companions splitting up and raising later uprisings in Sistan and Khorasan, even after the Zumbils caved to the caliphate's demands and executed him. Iraq and Persia would remain centers of anti-Umayyad discontent, and Afghanistan unconquered for the rest of the Umayyad era, with the same racial and sectarian tensions that had fueled first al-Mukhtar's and later Abd al-Rahman's rebellions, eventually leading to their downfall. As we imagine Musa ibn Nusayr stood on the shores of northwestern Africa, to him, any business he had in any city of the caliphate or at home was a world away, out of his control. That might have been a problem for him, and even if he had the internet, there would still be one more thing he needed to access his online world safely and remotely, our sponsor NordVPN. And he certainly needed to go to nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals for a special deal. Then he would be able to do his banking in Cairo, buy dyes from Tunis, and see a show in Baghdad, since NordVPN connects you to IP addresses the world over to access local services. But more importantly for Musa, it would be completely secure, impossible for his enemies to intercept any sensitive information he needed transferred across the world to conduct his business, thanks to NordVPN's heavy encryption. Also on top of that, their threat protection service fights viruses, malware, spam, and scams during everyday browsing. So if you're going to be traveling, want safety and security for your digital life, or simply want access to a piece of the internet reserved for someplace else, download NordVPN at nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals. With this link, you'll get 4 bonus months added on top of a 2-year plan, with a 30-day money-back guarantee to make it risk-free. Check it out at the link in the description. The years immediately following the Berber Queen Dia's defeat would be marked by both victory and some turmoil, particularly in Khorasan and Transoxiana, where caliphal authority had still not been fully restored since the Second Fitna. Between 692 and 705, the largely independent governor Musa ibn Abdallah had expanded his power base, first by conquering local Hephthalite and Sogdian city-states, even clashing with forces of the Tibetan Empire over influence in the region, then later forging local alliances in order to expand at the expense of other Arab governors in the region despite his nominal loyalty to the Caliph. Musa was eventually brought to heel and slain in a campaign ordered by al-Hajjaj and led by al-Mufaddal and Mudrik, both sons of Khorasan's previous governor al-Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra, with the aid of the Arab-friendly monarch Tarkhan, ruler of Samarkand, and the most powerful of the Sogdian rulers. However, the episode highlighted the increasing difficulty of maintaining control over such distant frontiers, and much of the following decades would see the Umayyads attempting to centralize their vast realm with varying degrees of success. A different sort of turmoil simmered in the capital during this same period. With Caliph Abd al-Malik now aged and sickly, thorny questions surrounding his succession began to arise. Though Abd al-Malik favoured his sons al-Walid and Sulayman as successors, his brother Abdulaziz, governor of Egypt, was the preferred candidate for many, despite his advanced age, particularly as their father, Caliph Marwan, now dead 20 years, had previously declared that Abdulaziz should succeed his brother. Abd al-Malik's request for his brother to renounce his claim and withdraw from succession drove a wedge between the two, with Abd al-Malik seemingly fearing another civil war, as evidenced by his attempts to compel tribute from Abdulaziz and chip away at his traditionally very autonomous power base. These fears were quelled when Abdulaziz died in late 704, though the continuing uncertainty surrounding succession spurred Abd al-Malik to make an unprecedented move, summoning his vassals to take their oath of allegiance to his son al-Walid while he still lived. Though power in the caliphate had now been dynastic for 24 years, swearing fealty to a designated heir before his succession marked a further departure from the elective tradition of the Rashidun and was disliked by many, with the respected judge and scholar Sa'id ibn Musayyib even being jailed and beaten for his refusal to swear the oath. Despite this dissatisfaction, al-Walid's reign would become one of the most successful of any Umayyad Caliph, and he took the throne after his father's death in October 705 without serious opposition. New conquests would swiftly follow on three main fronts. In the east, Governor al-Hajjaj, a trusted companion and advisor to the new caliph, would grow ever more influential, ruling Iraq and Persia like a kingdom of his own, and appointing his own governors to oversee further expansion. The most significant of these frontier governors were Qutayba ibn Muslim, who replaced al-Mufaddal as governor of Khorasan and continued the conquest of Transoxiana, and Muhammad ibn al-Qasim, governor of Fars, who would oversee the greatest Arab victories in India to date. In the west, Musa ibn Nusayr ruled the frontier as governor of Afriqiya, with Visigothic Spain the next target of the caliphate's unstoppable march. The first conquests of al-Walid's reign would be undertaken by Qutayba, who successfully took advantage of the feuding and conflict between the Sogdian principalities of the region to bring them into the caliphate's sway. Tish al-Awar, ruler of Cheganian, was facing aggression from the neighbouring principalities of Shuman and Akron to the north, at the base of the Hisan Mountains. To preserve his throne, he offered his tribute and fealty when Qutayba's army arrived in late 705, lending his strength to that of the Arabs in their swift campaign against his rival princes and against Balkh, the power centre of the Turkestan region. The disunity of the many princes of Transoxiana made it relatively easy for Qutayba to compel tribute from the region and bring it under the suzerainty of the caliphate, though his power in the region remained a delicate balancing act, as demonstrated by difficult campaigns such as his months-long conquest of Peykand, a mercantile city whose great wealth allowed it to attract soldiers and mercenaries from across Sogd to resist Qutayba for some time before its fall and brutal sacking. Indeed, he would be forced to wage several costly campaigns over the next few years, as individual rulers or small coalitions came into conflict with the new lords of the Oxus, with further fighting in Bukhara following Peykand's sacking.
706 also marked the beginning of a new set of hostilities against the Byzantines, undertaken by al-Walid's son Abbas ibn al-Walid and half-brother Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik. For the most part, resistance to these raids was on a local basis, the same Syrian Mahdites that had been resettled 2 decades ago by Justinian II, fighting without significant aid from Constantinople. One exception, and the largest clash during this period of hostilities, was the siege of Tyana, near today's Kemahisar, in either 706 or 708. Tyana was well fortified and a crucial strongpoint in the Cappadocian frontier, and Maslama's siege would not be an easy one, nor a challenge the Byzantines could ignore. The past years of civil strife had not been kind to the Byzantine army though. Justinian II, whose overthrow at the hands of Leontios had set off the crisis, had since returned to power with the aid of the Bulgars and had embarked on a purge of any he saw as complicit in his downfall, or as threats to his recently regained throne. This purge had ended the lives or careers of many capable officers, with many hanged from Constantinople's walls, even as the war-weary empire needed their talents most. This purge, and Justinian's fear of a single military leader winning glory and prestige enough to overthrow him, meant that the relief army sent to Tyana was hampered by ineffectual and divided leadership. The 2 officers in command, Theodori Cartarucus and Theophylact Salabus, are recorded as jockeying with each other for authority and disagreeing on tactical matters, undermining the army's morale and cohesion. Furthermore, the poor state of the army showed in the presence of a sizable but untrained peasant militia making up a portion of the Byzantine ranks, a far cry from the well-organized system of themes normally entrusted with defense on the frontiers. In the end, the relief army's arrival would mean more harm than help for the defenders of Tyana. Not only did its disorganized attack on the besieging Arabs fail, with the Byzantines being routed with great loss of life, but the supplies seized from the relief force allowed the hungry besiegers to wait out the defenders until Tyana finally surrendered. Having suffered from significant supply problems through the winter, the Arabs would likely have otherwise abandoned the siege and withdrawn, but after a 9-month siege, Tyana finally surrendered, by most accounts in the spring of 709. Victorious, Maslama had the fortress razed and the bulk of the Mahdites resettled into Syria once more, leaving the Cappadocia region depopulated and defenseless. Following these victories, the Caliphate would enjoy 4 relatively peaceful years, with al-Walid appointing new governors and ensuring his authority as the new Caliph was recognized across his vast realm. However, the years 711 and 712 would see 2 major campaigns erupt almost 7,000 kilometers away from each other on opposite sides of the Caliphate. While on the western front, Musa ibn Nusayr and Tariq ibn Ziyad brought the might of the Caliphate to Visigothic Hispania, the topic of our next video, a recent string of failures in the east had galvanized al-Walid and al-Hajjaj to redouble their efforts in India. Sindh had long been a base for pirates who preyed on vessels in the Indian Ocean. And of further concern was the sanctuary many Sassanid loyalists and various defeated rebels had received upon fleeing Umayyad territory for India. The apparent inciting incident for the campaign occurred when pirates seized 8 ships travelling from the kingdom of Anuradhapura in modern Sri Lanka, whose hulls contained jewels, pearls, slaves, and other gifts from King Manavama to the Caliph, as well as Muslim women on pilgrimage who were taken captive. Details on the first punitive expedition are scarce, but following the seizure of the ships and King Dahir of Sindh's refusal or inability to have them recovered from the pirates, Hajjaj petitioned a reluctant al-Walid for support in an invasion, which was finally granted. Led by a general named Bazail, 3,000 men sailed to the port city of Nerun near Pakistan's northern city of Hyderabad, before marching with a vengeance on the prominent pirate haven of Dibal. The garrison and local forces would crumble rapidly before the small Arab army, but this initial victory would last only until the arrival of Prince Jasir of Sindh with 4,000 men, mounted on camels and accompanied by war elephants. Though the Arabs fought valiantly, the elephants drove many of the Arab cavalry's horses to panic, including Bazail's own steed, leading to the general's death and the defeat of his already outnumbered army. Dahir and Sindh's victory would be very short-lived, however. Even before the launching of the second invasion, cracks were beginning to show in the kingdom. Fearing another invasion, the governor of Neron began paying tribute to al-Hajjaj, a sign of the breakdown in central authority in Sindh that had allowed the kingdom to become such a haven for pirates, and which would later see the caliphate gather significant support from within its borders. In addition, various tribes and communities existed effectively independently within Sindh borders, most notably the nomadic Jat people and the Meds of Balochistan, who lived along the coasts as fishermen and pirates. During the reign of Rai Chach, who established the Chacha dynasty in Sindh around the same time Islam was first emerging in Arabia, humiliating and discriminatory decrees had been leveled against such tribal groups, the Jat in particular. These included bans on their wearing of silk and carrying of swords, with children of prominent Jat leaders held hostage to enforce these rules. By the time of Al-Walid and Tahir, these grudges still ran deep, but the Crown of Sindh seemingly no longer had the power or authority to control its coasts or its populace, leaving large minority populations and disloyal vassals within the nation ready to take up arms against the state at the first showing of weakness. This opportunity would come swiftly, when in late 711 a second army was raised with Al-Walid's direct support, al-Hajjaj using the soldiers from Buzayl's army still held prisoner in Sindh as a further grievance to goad the Caliph into war. Under the leadership of Muhammad ibn Qasim, the still teenage governor of Fars and al-Hajjaj's brother-in-law, and counting 6,000 horsemen from the Caliphate's core Syrian army, an equal number of camel-mounted irregular warriors joining at Shiraz, and a further 3,000 at Makran, led by the province's elderly and sickly governor Muhammad ibn Harun, this army would greatly outnumber Buzayl's. And though his family ties and personal loyalty to al-Hajjaj seem to have contributed more to the young governor's selection as leader than his military experience, particularly with al-Hajjaj having suffered near defeat at the hands of one rebel general already, he would rapidly prove his skill as a commander in the years to follow. From Makran, the army marched into Sindh with a vengeance, first conquering the Balochi city of Armanbale, today's Bela, Pakistan. Despite his youth and his larger army, Ibn Qasim proceeded with greater caution than Buzayl had, wary of the Sindh prince's army that had foiled the first expedition, and constructing a series of fortified camps as he advanced to guard against ambush. Reaching Debal on October 28, 711, ships arrived to unload vast siege engines and catapults, along with frequent correspondence from al-Hajjaj, and the ever-cautious commander dug trenches around the besieged city to guard against any relief army or sortie before beginning a bombardment. While the 13th century Chachnamaz account of the siege to follow is rather fanciful, featuring a magical battle standard that rendered the city unconquerable until its flagpole atop the temple was shattered by a catapult stone, among other obvious embellishments, the basic overview of the brief siege is simple enough. After 7 days of bombardment from mangonels and the enormous catapult known as the Little Bride the Caliph had provided, the defenders of the city attempted to sally forth against the besieging army, only to be driven back easily. The following day, Ibn Qasim's army assaulted the battered walls from every direction, soon scaling the walls and storming the city. A brutal sack followed, with the city nearly razed, many killed as they sought refuge in the temple, and far more carried off as captives. Leaving the recently freed prisoners from Buzayl's army in charge of Debal, along with their former jailer Kubla, who was spared thanks to his kind treatment of the Muslim prisoners and swift conversion to Islam upon their victory, the great army swiftly departed their conquest to push on towards Neron, where Jaisiya was still encamped. Outnumbered by the approaching army and receiving word of the fall of Debal, the prince opted to withdraw to his father's side, commanding Neron's governor to resist the approaching Arabs, unaware of the tributary agreement he had already reached. When Ibn Qasim arrived in Neron soon after Jaisiya's departure, he found no resistance, instead being allowed to rest and resupply, while Jat and Med tribespeople, hostile to the Chach monarchs and hearing word of Qasim's victory, flocked to his banner. From here, he first went northwest along the west bank of the Indus,
conquering Sewan with little more difficulty than Debal, despite the stubborn defense of its leader Becerra, cousin to King Dahir. After another week-long siege, its citizenry, frightened by tales of Debal's raising, favoured surrender, eventually driving Becerra out in order to do so. A few days later, at Badia, Becerra attempted another stand after fleeing Sewan's fall, joining that city's headman, Karakotak, to launch a night attack against the encamped Arab army. 1,000 of his best warriors split into 4 groups for the raid, under cover of darkness, backed up by Jats loyal to Sindh. Confused orders would see the nighttime attack come to naught, however, with the 4 groups failing to properly coordinate in the darkness, some becoming lost and failing to reach the Arab army, while the rest were discovered and driven away by the alert sentries of the well-fortified camp. In the aftermath of this defeat, Karakotak submitted to Ibn Qasim as so many of Dahir's vassals had already, while Becerra and his loyalists were slain, bringing almost the whole of Sindh west of the Indus under the sway of the Caliphate. The true test would be the crossing of the Indus, however, and here Qasim's army, camped at Kahal, began to face difficulties. Dahir and Jassir stood ready on the opposite bank, the 2 armies at times within bowshot of each other, guarding against a crossing. Despite nominally commanding the loyalty of the nearby conquered cities, Qasim's position was still tenuous, based on a fear that the loyalty might fade if the conquerors showed too much weakness. Indeed, as the 50-day standoff across the Indus drew on, the Arabs found great difficulty in keeping themselves supplied, with the army beginning to suffer from hunger and disease and being forced to eat many of their horses, while Sewan rose in revolt behind them and expelled its recently installed Arab garrison. Though this revolt was quickly suppressed and 2,000 fresh horses laden with supplies were soon sent by al-Hajjaj, the long period of inactivity was clearly weakening the Arab position. Thus, on Hajjaj's orders, the army departed towards Thatta, most likely in May of 712. A successful crossing was made at Jim, today the site of Kinjar Lake, but at the time a relatively safe ford, where a small island stood in the middle of the Indus. Provided boats by the local leader, Moka Basaleh, Ibn Qasim had them filled with ballast and connected by planks to form a bridge, crossing before the unprepared Dahir could bring his forces to bar their way, and routing the paltry force under Moka's loyalist brother Rasil. From here, Qasim marched swiftly north towards the Sindhi capital of Aror, defeating several Sindhi armies along the way. At a lake just south of today's Nawab Shah, the first major engagement was fought, with Jaisir taking a strong force of soldiers and elephants to oppose the invaders. Though they fought bravely, and the elephants caused great chaos among the mounted Arabs, they were swiftly enveloped and hemmed in by their more mobile foes, with the majority of the army being cut down, while Jaisir broke through the foes surrounding him atop an elephant to escape to his father's side. This defeat further shook the confidence of Dahir's vassals, with Rasil now defecting to join his brother in Ibn Qasim's service, and securing boats to cross the lake as a sign of his new loyalty. Over the following 3 days, Dahir, facing loyalty problems and apparently allowing the readings of his astrologers to inform much of his strategy, threw several detachments against Ibn Qasim to no avail, allowing the Arabs to overcome these small forces piecemeal and reduce the Sindhi numbers advantage. On June 16, 712, following the advice of Muhammad ibn Haris, leader of the Muslim Alafi tribe, which had fled Makran after a blood feud brought them into conflict with al-Hajjaj, he finally brought his full army to bear against Ibn Qasim's army, which had crossed the lake, led by his lieutenant Uwais ibn Qais. Arranging his horsemen on the left, archers on his right, with foot soldiers supported by war elephants in the centre, the Sindhi army numbered approximately 20,000 men to Ibn Qasim's 15,000. Though he initially attempted to rout them with an elephant charge, the Arabs and their mounts now had experience fighting the great beasts, and divided into small groups to confuse and frighten the war elephants sent against them. Meanwhile, a cavalry charge by the Muslim second-in-command, Muriz ibn Sabat, into the enemy centre saw significant success, despite Muriz's own death in battle, causing great damage to the enemy before both forces were forced to withdraw after the day's bloody fighting.
The following day would be the climax of the conflict, with Dahir this time issuing forth his horsemen at the center of his army, while the Arabs shot arrows treated with flaming naphtha to panic the elephants. Initially, the battle favored the Sindhis, with Suja the Abyssinian, a renowned champion in Ibn Qasim's army, being killed with an arrow to the neck, and the Caliphal army beginning to retreat before the cavalry onslaught. Ibn Qasim managed to rally his forces, however, with Muqabasayya's own mounted detachment reinforcing his commander in the center as the battle raged across the banks of the lake. Soon, Dahir's lack of authority would be his undoing, with huge numbers of his levied footmen and archers fleeing, leaving mostly the dwindling noble-born cavalry to defend their king, as the rallying Arab army began to push back. As the left wing of his army began to rout, Dahir launched a last valiant charge from atop his elephant, only for a flaming arrow to set the litter he rode in aflame, causing the elephant to panic and rush into the water of the lake. Some of his remaining men attempted to rally about him in the shallows, but now cut off from retreat, the king and those about him were cut down by a volley from the Arab archers along the banks. While Jaysiya would escape to continue the war, this victory shattered the Sindhi resistance, with Ibn Qasim executing every prisoner, save the merchants and artisans, and few were willing to back Jaysiya in continuing a losing battle. Many towns and cities would swear fealty to Ibn Qasim and the Caliphate in the immediate aftermath, with Jaysiya holding out in Brahminabad until its fall to a siege nearly a year later in November 713 officially ended the Chach dynasty and the Kingdom of Sindh. This conquest, together with the simultaneous campaigns in Iberia, would soon bring the Umayyad Caliphate to near its greatest extent. Yet for all its power, the Caliphate was not invincible, and dangers both internal and external continued to loom. The Visigothic Kingdom of Iberia could trace its roots back to Alaric, the famous general who first fought for Emperor Theodosius against the Franks, holding the Balkans as a Roman foederati or semi-autonomous ally, before his relationship with the empire soured, and he became the first person to sack the Eternal City in over 700 years. The Visigoths had been one of the several so-called barbarian peoples to arrive in the territory of the crumbling Roman Empire, with various Gothic and other Germanic peoples found in great numbers throughout the empire and on its outskirts as slaves, soldiers, and allies. In the aftermath of Western Rome's fall, the Visigoths were among the first to carve out their own kingdom from its ashes. Though Alaric's power base had been in the Balkans, the Visigoths would migrate ever westward following his death, at times allies of convenience to the collapsing Roman Empire, and at other times taking advantage of the West's fall to expand their power. It would be in the Aquitaine region of western France that the Visigoths would first establish a true kingdom, from there pushing into Suebi-controlled Hispania at Rome's behest, their kingdom encompassing Aquitaine and nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula by the death of the great warrior and lawmaker King Euric in 484. The years that followed would be less kind, however, as easy expansion against the backdrop of a crumbling Rome gave way to new rivalries against other powerful barbarian kingdoms, most notably the Franks and Burgundians. It would not be long after Euric's death, during the reign of his successor Alaric II, that the Visigothic territories in France would fall to these northern rivals, led by the Merovingian king Clovis, leading to the establishment of Toledo as the new Visigothic capital. With the Pyrenees now forming a natural border, the Visigothic kingdom would remain secure in Hispania for the next 2 centuries, with occasional further conflicts with the Franks and a revanchist Eastern Roman Empire making little lasting change to the status quo. As the 8th century dawned, though, the Visigoths would unexpectedly find a far greater danger arising to their south. The Umayyad Caliphate's border with the Visigothic kingdom had been an embattled one since their first arrival, with raids into southern Iberia having begun as early as 706, following the conquest of Tangier in today's Morocco. In fact, the campaign that would spell the end of the Visigothic kingdom likely began as another of these large-scale raids, with the force of some 1,700 that crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in 710 under the leadership of Tariq ibn Ziyad, governor of Tangier, being quite sizable for a skirmishing party, but smaller than would be expected had they intended a campaign of conquest from the beginning. But circumstances favoured the Muslims. Following the recent death of King Witiza, the Visigothic kingdom had entered into a succession crisis, with Roderick in control of southern Iberia, pitted against the poorly documented Angela II in the north. However, this low-intensity civil war was only indicative of larger weaknesses within the Visigothic kingdom. While the Visigoths had ruled Iberia independently for more than 2 centuries at this point, and had exercised great autonomy under a weakened Rome for another century before their independence, they had continued to rule on essentially tribal lines, despite the scale of their kingdom rendering them inefficient. The feudal systems that would allow later kingdoms to efficiently raise armies through local vassals did not yet exist in Iberia, and while the landed aristocratic class of the Roman period had essentially merged with the Visigothic conquerors to form a unified ruling class, the ethnic Visigoths that still made up most of the readily available warriors the various Visigothic chiefs could draw on made up only a very small minority in the larger kingdom. King Recared's abandonment of the Arian sect of Christianity, traditionally followed by the Visigoths, in 589 in favour of their kingdom's majority Chalcedonian Christian faith, accompanied by the abandonment of the Gothic tongue as a church language, had done much to unify the Visigoths with their subjects. However, the Hispano-Roman aristocrats had not been a warrior nobility, and the kingdom lacked efficient administrative systems by which to mobilize its peasantry to war. While every denizen of the Visigothic kingdom was theoretically required to provide military service to the king on demand, this duty was owed directly to the king, rather than to a more accessible local intermediary, making it a duty only too easy to ignore for the vast majority of the population outside Toledo and the king's own domain. Thus, while the caliphate had been able to vastly expand its power through its conquests, through recruiting large numbers of converts in conquered territories for further campaigns, and by embracing the sophisticated administrative systems left behind by the Romans and Persians, coupled with laws laid down in the Quran, the military power of the Visigothic kingdom was not fundamentally changed from the tribal armies that had fought Rome under Alaric, its army still made up in large part by the personal warriors of Visigothic chiefs, despite the vastly larger Latin population they ruled over. In addition to the relative unpreparedness of their foes, the Arabs had a valuable ally on their side, Count Julian of Ceuta, who was most likely a Byzantine governor who had switched his allegiance upon his empire's abandonment of North Africa, rather than attempting to fight a doomed resistance against the Arabs. While it seems he aided by providing his suzerain ships for the crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar, his larger role in the story is somewhat in question. Despite his importance in later accounts, which claim he had made the first attack on Iberia with his own forces in 709, seizing loot with which to entice the Arabs to destroy Roderick for him and avenge his daughter's rape at the Visigothic king's hands. No mention of this grudge exists in the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, the earliest surviving account of the invasion. And neither Julian's subservience to the more powerful Arabs, nor Musa's predictable decision to expand into the rich lands of the Visigoths require any tales of vengeance to explain. The accounts that paint Julian as the architect of the Visigothic kingdom's conquest also clash with both the Mozarabic Chronicle's assertion that Arab raiding had begun years before the conquest, and with the common narratives of later Christian accounts, which claim that it was the enemies of Roderick within Iberia that requested and facilitated the Muslim invasion. While any of these stories might be at least partially true, they are likely irrelevant. With North Africa subjugated and inhospitable, with difficult-to-traverse desert to the south, the Caliphate's invasion of Hispania was an inevitability, whether Roderick was guilty of raping Julian's daughter or not, and Julian would have been compelled to support Musa as a caliphal vassal, with or without any personal grudge. Anecdotally, as a side note, the modern name of the Strait of Gibraltar is named for Tariq, in a corruption of the Arabic Jabal Tariq or Tariq's mountain. The renewal of raiding in the south went at first unanswered by the Visigoths, allowing Tariq to establish a secure base of operations on the site that would later become the town of Algeciras, from there pushing deeper into Iberia. They would face their first opponent shortly after,
Theodomir, a Visigothic count holding extensive territories near Mercia, who, with his force of some 1,700 men, attempted to delay the invaders in a series of skirmishes while sending reports and pleas for aid back to Roderick. The establishment of this base, and the arrival of further Muslim reinforcements, quickly demonstrated to Roderick that this was no common raid, and he began assembling what forces he could muster at Cordoba, sending a force of cavalry ahead to aid Theodomir in his resistance, and instructing the Count to withdraw northward to join him. Meanwhile, he began his own much slower march south, hindered by poor logistics, the slow arrival of reinforcements from disloyal vassal chieftains, and a lack of discipline among the conscripted serfs. He finally regrouped with the battered remnants of Theodomir's force at Guadelete, their numbers weakened after a series of skirmishes over at least a month that greatly favoured the mobile Berber cavalry making up the bulk of Tariq's forces, which had also been mercilessly raiding the countryside so as to force Roderick into a battle on the field. Guadelete would soon be the site of a historically pivotal but poorly documented battle that has been the basis of countless conflicting tales and legends. The numbers involved are very much in question, with later Christian chronicles claiming as high as 187,000. Though the number given for the Muslim forces in the Mozarabic chronicle, 7,000 in Tariq's initial landing force, with 5,000 reinforcements, bringing the total to 12,000, is likely at least significantly inflated as well, it is at least plausible considering the readiness of converted Berbers to join Musa's forces across subjugated North Africa. No figures are given for the Visigothic forces under Roderick, save a similarly unlikely 100,000 claimed by later Arab chronicles. The defenders did most likely outnumber the invaders, with over 30,000 in the highest modern estimates, though given the previously mentioned challenges in mobilizing their Hispano-Roman subjects, even a number half this large is likely generous, but they face problems of disloyalty that undermined their small numbers advantage. Some recurring themes found in both Muslim and Christian sources may shed some light on the events of the Bloody July Day. The previously mentioned Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, though a useful source for information on the Visigothic kingdom's history and politics, mentions the Battle of Guadelete only in passing and elaborates little on the tactics involved. It does, however, make it clear that many of the more powerful Visigothic tribal leaders had only feigned their support when accompanying their king to battle, intending to lead Roderick to his downfall and claim the throne themselves. And while later accounts are of questionable reliability, this general narrative of betrayal surrounding the kingdom's fall remains a constant. Some accuse Roderick of having had Witiza assassinated in a coup attempt, while many other accounts are quite hostile towards Witiza and his line as a result of the late king's anti-clerical policies, with villainization of Witiza growing harsher and more common as time passed. Witiza's opposition to a series of discriminatory decrees by the Spanish church councils targeting Iberia's large Jewish population might have contributed to this, given the growing hostility towards Europe's Jews in the era of the Crusades and Reconquista, a period that had seen renewed interest in the fallen Visigothic kingdom and to which many of these later chronicles trace. Many of these chronicles even suggest that two sons of Witiza, seeking to claim their father's throne, had invited the Arabs into Iberia, or that Iberia's Jews had used their close ties to the Jews of North Africa to do the same, seeking an opportunity to end their long suffering under the harsh anti-Semitic policies of the Visigothic kingdom and its church, which since 694 had even allowed for any Jew refusing baptism to be enslaved. Neither story seems likely, especially considering Witiza was unlikely to have been older than 25 himself when he died, making any children he might have had rather young for such scheming. But whatever the case, if anyone had hoped to take advantage of the Muslim incursion to claim the Visigothic throne, they would be very disappointed. Roderick had his loyal Visigothic warriors, armoured and bearing axes and swords, split into two contingents, the larger making up the centre of the vanguard, and a smaller detachment held in reserve. Behind these staunch defenders, the ill-equipped levies he had raised from his domain around Toledo
and during the mustering at Cordoba were arrayed, in a particularly sorry state even for peasant conscripts. Roderic's hurry to engage the invaders, leaving little time to see these slaves and serfs equipped or drilled. On the wings were the forces of allied chieftains, many of questionable loyalty, and the kingdom's comparatively meagre cavalry remaining after the losses inflicted during Theodemir's fighting retreat. Tariq, though outnumbered, had far more cavalry than his foe, and fewer concerns of morale and loyalty. Though the majority of the Arab warriors that had come forth from Syria to conquer North Africa had either returned home or remained behind with Musa, he had a strong contingent of heavily equipped Arab cavalry making up his army's centre, with Berber and Arab infantry behind them, while Berber light cavalry on the wings and in the rearguard made up the bulk of his army. Accounts vary greatly, but it would seem that the first 2 days of fighting remained more or less in the balance, with both armies suffering mounting casualties and with greater Visigothic numbers seemingly giving them the edge at first. Both leaders encouraged their forces with speeches, Tariq chastising his forces for falling back during the second day's fighting, claiming that only by holding fast and seizing victory could they hope to survive and return home, and promising to lead them to riches and glory on the following day. When the third day's fighting began, Tariq would prove true to his word, personally leading his heavier cavalry in a charge that broke through the Visigothic warriors making up Roderic's centre. With the enemy vanguard depleted by 2 days' fighting, Tariq's cavalry soon found themselves with nothing but scattering serf levies between them and the enemy leaders and rearguard, with the Muslim infantry taking advantage of the breach and following closely behind. The circumstances of the following rout are unclear. A Visigothic leader slain early in the charge seems to have been mistaken by the Muslims for Roderick, starting a false rumour of the king's death that hastened panic and desertion in an army already held together by very little. Some accounts claim that much of the Visigothic cavalry under Bishop Oppa, a possibly illegitimate son of Witus's father and predecessor Egica, defected to Tariq as part of a prearranged betrayal, and while this claim is rather doubtful, it is clear that many did desert the king as the tables began to turn. A general rout soon followed, as the levies broke and the Berber cavalry charged the enemy flanks, running down fleeing soldiers. Though Roderic's personal forces put up a staunch defence despite their broken lines, inflicting sizable casualties, the premature rumour of the king's death would soon prove to have come only a few hours too early, and by the fierce battle's end, the king and a sizable portion of the Visigothic nobility had been slain. Though nearly 3,000, close to a quarter of the Muslim force had been among the casualties, losses had been far greater for the defeated Visigoths, and their kingdom would not long outlive their fallen king. With the Visigothic kingdom so reliant on the military dominance of its ruling minority, and commanding little loyalty from its subjects, this single crushing defeat effectively spelled its end. Tariq was quick to march to Toledo in the aftermath, where Oppa, who does not in fact seem to have been present at Guadelete despite later claims of his battlefield betrayal, had taken the Visigothic throne. Oppa would prove a ready collaborator with the conquerors, aiding them in capturing and executing many of the remaining Visigothic chiefs and nobility as they made to flee the capital. 712 would see Musa cross the strait with another army to join his victorious underling in pacifying the remainder of Iberia, with Tariq's army splitting into 4 in order to more swiftly overcome what little scattered resistance remained. Some cities would put up spirited defences, with Seville requiring a 3-month siege and Merida 5 for Musa's army to capture, and with Seville even rising shortly in late 713 in a rebellion crushed by Musa's son Abdelaziz. However, the Visigoths' unpopularity in the urban centres, such as Cordoba, left many ready to accept their new conquerors, and even the Mazarabic Chronicle, though quite hostile towards the Arabs, makes note of Cordoba's flourishing after its later establishment as the capital of the new caliphal province of Al-Andalus in 716. Though Oppa and some new other figures from the old ruling class retained a degree of their former status through collaboration, there would be no more Visigothic kings, and their lines quickly fade into obscurity. If Oppa, Angela, or any others had indeed conspired with the Muslims to take the throne, their ploy had failed, with the Visigoths being assimilated into the larger Iberian Christian population and their power broken. In their place, Musa placed Arabs in most positions of power within the newly conquered state, though the Muslims did also rely heavily on Iberia's Jews to help hold and administer their new territory. With the harsh restrictions put in place by the Visigoths lifted, Jewish communities were among the most eager in accepting the change of rulership, and many Jews rose to positions of prominence as advisors and officials under the comparatively even-handed governance of early Al-Andalus. However, this story would end in tragedy even for many of the victors, and Musa and Tariq would not enjoy the fruits of their success for long. By 715, they had completed the initial conquest of the peninsula, overrunning the lands of the Basques and the northern territories held by Angela, who disappeared from the record, making his supposed collaboration with the Arabs unlikely. But just as Musa had himself taken power in North Africa after the political disgrace of its conqueror, Hassan ibn al-Numan, Tariq and Musa, by this point feuding with each other over the spoils and glory of the conquest, a precursor for more Arab-Berber hostility to come, would be summoned to Damascus by a sickly and aging al-Walid, only to find the Caliph already on his deathbed upon their arrival, and his brother Sulayman the acting monarch. Mired in a rocky succession, with al-Walid having backed his son Abdelaziz ibn al-Walid for the throne, Sulayman ordered Musa to delay his triumphant entrance into Damascus until after al-Walid expired and he properly became Caliph. In doing this, Sulayman hoped to claim some of the glory of the conquest to inaugurate his new reign. Musa refused, however, entering and dedicating his victory and the spoils to al-Walid. This did little to ingratiate him with Sulayman, with predictable results after al-Walid's death less than a week later. Tariq and Musa were both first stripped of their wealth, then disgraced and publicly paraded as traitors, ostensibly in response to Musa's complaints towards the confiscation, but in all likelihood an inevitable part of the broader crackdown on al-Walid's governors and loyalists that took place upon Sulayman's inauguration. The two conquerors of Al-Andalus would live the rest of their lives in obscurity, while Musa's sons, Abdelaziz and Abdullah, left behind as governors of Al-Andalus and Ifriqiya respectively, would both be killed on the Caliph's orders. Sulayman's mishandled efforts to assert his control over the far-flung provinces of the empire would backfire in Al-Andalus, however, with the death of Abdelaziz sparking a period of self-destructive infighting, spurred largely by the resentment among the Berbers towards their lesser treatment compared to their Arab co-religionists, despite playing such a vital role in Iberia's conquest. With the conquerors turned against each other, their hold on Iberia would begin to show cracks almost as swiftly as they had won it, with the mountainous northern territories breaking away under the Visigothic noble Pelagius to form the Kingdom of Asturias in 722. It was not the far-flung western frontier of Iberia that Sulayman would spend his short reign focused on, however. Eager to forge his own legacy to match his brothers in the short time remaining to him, he would soon turn the armies of the Caliphate towards a prize long denied them, Constantinople. Upon his ascension to the caliphal throne, Sulayman wasted no time replacing most of his brother and predecessor's loyal governors and advisors, despite the monumental successes many of them had achieved during the storied reign of al-Walid. In al-Walid's last years of life, he had attempted to remove Sulayman from succession in favour of his son Abdelaziz, without success, even requesting his governors swear fealty to Abdelaziz before his death. However, few saw fit to take this risky stance against Sulayman, who was the horse with the best odds. Moreover, the rocky succession and support for Abdelaziz from al-Hajjaj, one of the most powerful men in the caliphate, created deep divides in the Umayyad court and caused Sulayman to see enemies around every corner. As a result, after Musa refused to delay his entry to the capital until after al-Walid's death, so Sulayman might claim the glory, both Musa and Tariq were stripped of their titles and disgraced. Qutayba ibn Muslim, who had brought Islamic rule to most of Transoxiana through a combination of military victories and shrewd diplomacy, would be extended the offer to keep his position by Sulayman, likely due to the large power base Qutayba commanded and the threat of civil war. Despite this placation, Qutayba, suspecting Sulayman would turn on him as soon as he felt secure enough to do so, and resenting the appointment of his longtime rival Yazid ibn al-Muhallab as the new governor of Iraq and Persia, denounced Sulayman as illegitimate and rallied his troops against the new caliph. Unfortunately for Qutayba, his position had never been as powerful or secure as al-Hajjaj's, and his attempt to raise his army in rebellion against Sulayman caused many of his soldiers, particularly his fellow Arabs, to betray and kill him under the leadership of Waki ibn Abi Sud. Although Waki would take over as governor of Transoxiana, the following years would see many of Qutayba's successes in the region reversed in a string of defeats and rebellions, and Arab control of Transoxiana would remain unstable for decades to follow. Meeting a similar end would be the famous conqueror of Sindh, Muhammad ibn al-Qasim. As another ally of al-Hajjaj's who had opposed Sulayman's ascension, Ibn al-Qasim was removed from power by Sulayman and promptly placed under arrest by his replacement as governor of Sindh, Yazid ibn Abi Kabsha, and sent to Ibn al-Muhallab's custody to be tortured and executed. Recently conquered Iberia would also see a similar power vacuum created with the execution of Musa ibn Nasir's two sons, the governors of Ifriqiya and Al-Andalus, leading to a period of the same self-destructive infighting. Meanwhile, Ibn al-Muhallab quickly stepped into the powerful role al-Hajjaj had long filled, and prepared for new conquests in the east. With anarchy reigning in the caliphate's distant western frontiers, Sulayman's focus was far closer to home. For a caliph looking to make his mark on history, no possible victory could outshine the conquest of Constantinople, a city that had already beaten back a 4-year siege under Caliph Muawiyah and was supposedly the focus of prophecies from Muhammad himself. It would seem preparations for the siege had already begun before Sulayman's ascension as caliph, either under the orders of al-Walid directly or during the period in which Sulayman served as acting ruler for his dying brother. Hardly surprising, given the years of frequent coups and turmoil that had weakened the Byzantines during al-Walid's relative golden age. During al-Walid's later years, Arab raids had penetrated ever deeper and more brazenly into Anatolia, with his sons al-Abbas and Marwan ibn al-Walid and his half-brother Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik penetrating north of the Taurus Mountains in 711 and 712, conquering Misthea in the Laconia region, and raiding as far as Amasya and modern-day Chankara along the Black Sea by 715. By contrast, the Romans in the same period saw 3 emperors deposed in coups. With Sulayman spending the year 715 consolidating his hold on the caliphate and building his strength, it would be in 716 that one of the single largest expeditions in caliphal history would be launched, with a land army under the command of Maslama, the brother of Caliph Sulayman, supported by a fleet under Umar ibn Halbrayra al-Hazari. Wielding the resources of a caliphate which was far vaster than the greatly weakened Roman Empire, the odds seemed stacked far more firmly against the Romans. Unfortunately, the vast expedition assembled by Sulayman and Maslama shared one major weakness with Muawiyah's earlier invasion: a reliance on collaboration with Roman rebels. Muawiyah had counted on the rebel Armenian general Saborios, then in control of much of Anatolia, to supply and aid his army in the march to Constantinople, only for his untimely death to undermine years of planning, stranding the first Arab expedition in hostile territory without supplies or allies, starvation and attrition defeating them more surely than the armies defending Constantinople's walls or the Greek fire devastating their fleets in the Bosphorus. Maslama, seemingly hoping to avoid the Herculean task of besieging and storming the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, planned to avoid having to take the city by force by getting directly involved in Byzantine politics, taking advantage of the civil strife and frequent palace coups that had weakened the Eastern Roman Empire by backing his own claimant to the Byzantine throne, the strategos Leo the Isaurian, whose role in the lead-up to the siege varies somewhat between Roman and Arab accounts.
In the Roman narrative, it is Sulayman ibn Mu'adh who first reaches out to negotiate with Leo, and who first raises the possibility of Leo taking the throne while besieging Amorion, offering to lift his siege and spare the city if they would accept Leo as their emperor. According to this tradition, Sulayman intended to capture Leo, knowing of the Strategos' enmity for Emperor Theodosius, who had taken power in a coup in May of the previous year, and convince him to take the throne with Arab backing and lead the empire into submission and vassalage. Yet despite holding correspondence with first Sulayman and then Maslama, in the Roman narrative, Leo never falls into Arab hands or forms any pact with the invaders. Escaping their net through trickery, he rallied the defences of the countryside behind him, foiling Sulayman ibn Mu'adh's advance force, before seizing control of the empire from the weak and unpopular Theodosius on his own, after capturing the royal household with his army at Nicomedia. In contrast, the Arab narrative has Leo reach out to Caliph Sulayman to negotiate, deceitfully assuring him that he will deliver Constantinople into Arab hands. Though either account could be somewhat falsified, the level of trust Maslama shows to Leo later in the siege would be highly surprising had their initial interactions been so short and hostile, as claimed in the account of Theophanes the Confessor, suggesting at least some arrangements had been made between the two, whether the Arab accounts are fully truthful or not. It should be noted that the dates are also slightly inconsistent between these two accounts, with the history of al-Tabari placing the siege somewhat earlier than Theophanes the Confessor. While both provide valuable insight, the latter provides more consistent dates and is far closer to being contemporary with the events enclosed, with the following dates primarily being those given by Theophanes. In either case, the winter of 716 would end this first stage of the campaign, one which saw modest Arab gains in Anatolia, the overthrow of an emperor, and a great deal of underhanded dealing, but little in the way of direct engagement of the two armies. The year had been a more active one in the east, although on this front, the Arabs met with little success. Yazid ibn al-Muhallab attempted a large-scale invasion of Jurjan and Tabaristan, the seat of the Dayyubid dynasty, and the last of the independent vestiges of the Sassanid Empire, which had thus far kept its old rulers at the cost of paying tribute to the Caliph. Initially successful, he captured the town of Dihistan by siege, with a large massacre ensuing, strengthening his reputation for brutality and causing the region of Jurjan to capitulate without resistance and accept an Arab governor. Continuing west into Tabaristan, Yazid would see less success. The ruling Spabed Farrukh Khan the Great appealed to his eastern neighbours in the Dailam region for military aid, and used the narrow mountain passes to hold off Yazid's much larger army. His army fell back, seemingly beaten in their first clash, only to lead the Muslims into an ambush, where they were pelted by arrows and boulders from higher ground and forced to withdraw. Though Yazid still commanded by far the stronger army, Farrukh Khan's successful resistance spurred the nobility of Jurjan, who had surrendered previously, to take up arms, killing most of the recently installed Arab garrison during the night. With his supplies now cut off and hostile forces at his back, Yazid was forced to sue for peace, using the threat of renewed invasion to secure an increased tribute, but failing entirely in his mission of conquest despite the vast resources at his disposal. In Transoxiana, Waki ibn Abi Sud had failed to inspire the same respect among the locals Qutayba had, leading to turmoil and the gradual loss of caliphal control over much of the region. However, Waki's main focus seemed to be a growing rivalry with Yazid, rather than on keeping order in his province. After wintering in Cilicia, Umar would take to the sea again in 717, holding the dominant position in the Mediterranean, but still wary of facing Greek fire in the Bosphorus, while Maslama would finally reach Constantinople's walls in June. Perhaps learning from past failures, Maslama's army had brought vast stores of food to last them a long siege, with more being ferried to them from Egypt and Syria under the protection of Umar's fleet, with transport vessels and dromon warships travelling in a convoy system for protection. To demonstrate his forces' commitment to the siege, no matter how long it should take, Maslama had forbidden his forces to eat from the rich stockpile of provisions they had brought.
instead building low walls and wooden houses for the besiegers around the city, and sowing crops in the ground to sustain them. Feeding themselves by plunder and soon by their own harvests, Maslama's massive besieging force was transformed almost into a small city of its own, and looked well prepared to weather the bitter winter approaching. But according to the Arab accounts of the siege, Leo and Maslama remained in negotiations at this point. Leo still feigned allegiance to the Umayyad prince, and claimed he was doing his best to convince his subjects to surrender. In the main version of the tale, Leo claims that Constantinople's inhabitants would surrender in exchange for the Arabs' food stores to feed their trapped and hungry citizens and demonstrate the truth of Maslama's promises of safety in exchange for submission. When Maslama agreed, they looted the Arab army's stores and crops by night before returning to their defences in the morning. In another version, Maslama even burns his own supplies on Leo's insistence that Constantinople would surrender without a battle if convinced Maslama was preparing for a major assault. At face value, these accounts might seem unlikely, but at this point, Maslama was negotiating from a position of strength. With transport ships from Tunis and Egypt resupplying him, he risked little, and an opportunity to avoid the daunting siege might have been too tempting to pass up. Whether the tales are true, or simply a way to scapegoat one commander for a broader military failure, the Arab naval supremacy would not be long-lived. As the fleet continued to arrive and ferry soldiers for the siege, many sailing past the city as far north as modern Istanbul's Ortaköy neighbourhood, the convoys would be forced to sail past the Golden Horn, which was blocked with a chain and harboured the Roman fleet, which had been waiting for their moment of opportunity. For the large and unwieldy transport ships to sail north against the currents of the Dardanelles required a south wind. On September 1st, an unlucky change of weather would see 20 of these large and logistically vital ships betrayed by the breeze and drift backwards with the current away from the safety of their escorts. The Roman fleet wasted no time, sailing out from the Golden Horn to bathe them and their crews in liquid fire, a harsh blow with a cold winter approaching and a hit to the morale of the Arab fleet. In the historian al-Tabari's words, the besiegers were forced to eat everything but dirt, suffering greatly over a cold winter outside the city. On this somber note, Caliph Sulayman would breathe his last, dying in October 717. In his brief reign, none of his grand ambitions had come to fruition, as Yazid ibn al-Muhallab's invasion had been a failure and the attack on Constantinople had been stalled. The legacy Sulayman had killed so many for and worked so desperately to build would largely be one of setbacks and failures, overshadowed by the triumphs of his predecessor. Sulayman had initially intended to be succeeded by his son, Ayub, but Ayub had died earlier in the year of a plague that was possibly Sulayman's cause of death as well. Instead, on his deathbed, he declared his younger cousin, Umar ibn Abdulaziz, a longtime ally of Sulayman's who had served as his governor of Medina, to be his successor as caliph, creating surprise and resentment among closer family members such as his brothers Yazid and Hisham, though Yazid was promised right of succession after Umar. It was no coincidence that the newly crowned Umar II shared a name with the legendary second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab. Through his mother's side, he was the second caliph's great-grandson, a prestigious connection he emphasized greatly. With the arrival of spring, the pressure began to mount on the Arab army besieging Constantinople. The loss of the supply ships the previous autumn had reaffirmed the superiority of Roman ships in combat. However, Leo's fleet lacked the numbers to actively patrol outside the Dardanelles, or safely scout the movements of the Arab ships. With the arrival of spring, sizable fleets from Egypt and Tunis came bringing supplies across the Mediterranean to the besiegers. Keeping their distance from Constantinople, they landed secretly in various places, from Chalcedon to the mouth of the Gulf of Nicomedia, on the Asian side of modern Istanbul. However, the crews of these fleets were mostly Coptic Christians of Egyptian descent, thousands of whom had been relocated to work the shipyards of Tunis after the conquest of North Africa by Hassan ibn al-Numan. Upon the fleet's arrival on Roman soil, organized mutinies among the Egyptian crews broke out among the Arab fleet, with the crews taking control of some ships, while many others escaped, fleeing to sanctuary among their fellow Christians in Constantinople. With the fleets paralyzed and crippled by the loss of so many crewmen, and Leo informed of the Arab fleet's location and sudden weakness by the defectors, the Roman fleet sailed forth once more from the Golden Horn, capturing or destroying the great Arab fleets nearly in their entirety. While the land army still held firm at first, the Romans had retaken full naval dominance for the time being. They cut the besiegers off from supplies or effective reinforcement, with the army divided by the now uncrossable Dardanelles. The entry into the conflict of the Bulgarian Khanate, ruled by Leo's ally Khan Tervel, would spell further disaster for the Arabs. With the besiegers on the European side of the Dardanelles cut off from retreat, without ships to ferry them across, a huge portion of the demoralized army, forced to spread out across the countryside to forage for food, and unprepared for the attack of a lightning-fast cavalry army, would be defeated and massacred. With the army facing destruction on the European side, smaller defeats at Roman hands in Asia, and starvation throughout, Umar would end the grand expedition and call his cousin Maslama home, leaving more than 20,000 dead to hunger, Greek fire, or Bulgar horsemen behind them. The disaster would weaken the Umayyad state and serve as something of a turning point. Though Umar would be well remembered for his political reforms, this largely marked the end of the great Umayyad conquests. More than the loss of manpower and ships at Constantinople, overextension and the rise of powerful governors would sap the ability of the Umayyads to project power outwards. Already the frontiers of Transoxiana and Iberia had been left almost completely to their own devices, with little support from faraway Syria, as anarchy and infighting ate away at the Caliphate's power in these far-flung regions. Only a few years before, the Umayyads had seemed at the height of their power, with illustrious conquerors expanding the Caliphate on every front. The death of these remarkable generals and leaders at Sulayman's hands only foreshadowed the death of the age of expansion they had championed. Umar would attempt to address some of these problems during his short and mostly peaceful reign. The poor treatment of non-Arab Muslims, a common cause for rebellion in past decades, would improve, with the jizya tax now exempted for all Muslims rather than Arabs only, and attempts at reconciliation with the Shia would be made as well. Yet this is largely seen as the start of a stagnation and decline that would last until the Umayyads' overthrow some 3 decades later. Following Sulayman's death and the end of his disastrous period as Caliph in 717, the Caliphate was granted a brief reprieve from its troubles through the mostly peaceful and uneventful 3-year reign of Umar II. Despite a small Iraqi Kharijite rebellion in 718, seeing some initial success against local forces, Syrian troops swiftly put it down under Umar's cousin Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, and the frontiers remained mostly quiet during Umar's brief reign, and the attempted political and social reforms he championed. As seen in previous episodes, numerous revolts against the Caliphate had come about due to the poor treatment of non-Arab converts to Islam, or Mawali. Rebellion among Persian-speaking Iraqis had threatened to topple the Umayyad dynasty twice, under Muqta al-Thaqafi during the Second Fitna and Ibn al-Ash'ath in 700 AD, and Iberia was plagued by ongoing strife between its Berber and Arab conquerors. Umar made efforts to address this problem, making all Muslims exempt from the jizya tax, rather than Arabs only, which, coupled with expanded missionary activity to encourage conversion in his still minority Muslim empire, brought some degree of improved cohesion and stability at the cost of cutting into the Caliphate's tax revenues. However, several events during his reign would have long-term repercussions. First, the Caliphate met its limit on its far eastern frontiers, where the Arab holdings in Transoxiana became the battleground against a new rival in the form of Tang China. The Caliphate's holdings in the region were recent conquests brought about by Qutayba ibn Muslim, who had since been a victim of Sulayman's purges, leaving the distant frontier bereft of this popular and skillful leader. Thus, when the Arabs were drawn into an ongoing conflict between the Tang and the Tibetan Empire as a Tibetan ally, it would soon spell disaster. The caliphal vassal Khan Suluk of the Turgesh's invasion of the Tarim Basin would meet staunch opposition from Ashinashan, a leader amongst the Western Turkic Khaganate and a commander of the so-called Protectorate General to pacify the West. Despite both the Arabs and Tibetans sending significant reinforcements for this offensive push, and holding a numerical advantage, the mostly Turkic Tang-aligned force opposing them would win a decisive victory, breaking the siege of Aksu, while another Chinese force simultaneously defeated the Tibetans along the Yellow River, assuring Chinese dominance in the region for the next few decades. Suluk, for his part, promptly switched to the winning side and swore fealty to the Tang after his defeat at Aksu, even going on to attack his former overlords in Fergana, a poorly defended region. There was little support from the Caliphate's core to be found on the frontiers, for reasons we will soon cover. However, this period did see success in Al-Andalus, where Governor Al-Sam ibn Malik had managed to bring most of the Arab-Berber infighting under control, allowing him to capture such major holdouts as Barcelona and Narbonne from the Visigothic remnant under King Ardo in 719, with the aid of Syrian and Yemeni new arrivals. With the minting of the first Arab coins in Iberia, marking their gradual transformation from a mere occupying army to the vibrant hybrid civilization Al-Andalus would later become. Closer to home, the rapid succession of caliphs was creating its own problems, among them the arrest and later escape of Yazid ibn al-Muhallab, formerly governor of Iraq under Sulayman, and the leader of the ambitious and increasingly powerful Muhallabid family. Over the previous decades, the prestigious position of governor of Iraq had come to hold power almost rivaling that of the caliph himself, given its traditional oversight over all of the caliph's eastern provinces, making the stance of Iraq's governor a major factor in any thorny or contested caliphal succession, such as those of Sulayman and Umar. Umar and Ibn al-Muhallab had bad blood between them already when Umar took the throne, and the governor knew he only had worse problems ahead should Umar be succeeded as caliph by Yazid ibn Abd al-Malik, whose in-laws from the family of the renowned former governor al-Hajjaj had been tortured and executed on Ibn al-Muhallab's orders during a previous political power struggle. Thus, after being recalled from his governorship and arrested for withholding from the caliph the spoils of war from his difficult-to-Baristan campaign during Sulayman's reign, Yazid ibn al-Muhallab opted to escape prison with his family's aid in 720 and returned to Iraq as Umar lay sickly and dying, rather than trusting himself to the mercies of the coming regime. Umar's death in the same year brought Yazid ibn Abd al-Malik to the throne as Caliph Yazid II. Thus, the all-too-short years of peace under Umar were brought to an end, as Yazid was immediately forced to contend with a Muhallabid rebellion in Iraq. However, not all challenges to the caliphate would be as open or as blatant as those of the Muhallabids. It was during these same few years that Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Abdallah ibn Abbas, the patriarch of another important family based in Khorasan, first began to spread anti-Umayyad propaganda and build a network of support around a demand for rule by blood relatives of the Prophet. And while his and his family's efforts on such a distant frontier attracted little attention from the Umayyads in Damascus at the time, the name Abbasid would soon be known throughout every corner of the caliphate. The new caliph would take no half measures against Ibn al-Muhallab upon learning of his escape and subsequent refusal to swear fealty, and even before any armies had met in battle, he took steps to undermine the influence of the Muhallabid family. 3 brothers of the rebellious former governor were arrested and imprisoned, despite having not directly participated in their brothers' acts of defiance, deepening the rift. Meanwhile, Yazid ibn al-Muhallab travelled as fast as he could to Basra, where other relatives of his were among the prominent nobility and joined their own forces to his to create a formidable army. This began a standoff with the local forces in Basra, with the Muhallabids demanding the release of their imprisoned kin and spreading bribes among the defending soldiers in Basra to weaken the defenders' resolve and attract more support in their opposition to the caliph. The dwindling defenders under Adi ibn Attat attempted to hold the city, but were defeated piecemeal, with part of the army splitting from the main body to hold the city's western caravan quarter, though whether this was due to a breakdown of authority among the demoralized defenders or a poor strategic decision on Artat's part, this force would be attacked and routed from the city before the main confrontation began. The remaining defenders eventually rode out from the fortress to engage the Mohalabid besieging force in a nearby cemetery, but despite the staunch core of Syrian horsemen bolstering the local forces, they were soon defeated as well, with the rebels pushing past them in the confusion of their defeat to seize the fortress, capturing Basra and rescuing Yazid ibn al-Muhallab's imprisoned brothers. Though Caliph Yazid II's reign had barely begun, he already faced a serious challenge to his rule. Sparing Adi ibn Artat, the victorious rebel began appointing his own governors in the territories around Basra, while tribal leaders and army commanders loyal to the caliphate fled to Kufa and Syria. Interestingly, it seems the conflict very nearly reached a peaceful conclusion at this point. One of these retreating tribal leaders, al-Hawari ibn Ziyad, came across two messengers from the caliph escorting Yazid ibn al-Muhallab's nephew and a generous peace offer. The new caliph apparently valuing stability over any family feud and willing to return Ibn al-Muhallab's relatives and governorship. However, Ibn Ziyad argued against this, informing the messengers of Artat's defeat and insisting Ibn al-Muhallab could not be trusted, convincing them to turn back. Ibn Ziyad's own family rivalry with the Mohallabids may have played into his actions, as Ibn al-Muhallab's nephew, Humayd, suggested in his pleas to the messengers to continue on to his uncle. But whatever his reasons, he ensured through a few words that the civil strife would continue. However, despite Caliph Yazid's reluctance to do battle, the advantage was nevertheless his. While the Mohallabids had secured the support of most of the tribes and army commanders in Basra, aided by lingering resentment towards the caliphate lasting since the tyrannical reign of al-Hajjaj, they had been too slow to seize control in Kufa before its reinforcement, despite the prominent places many members of the dynasty had held in the region. Thus, after some skirmishing against General Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik that saw the Euphrates crossed and the Al-Jazira region retaken by Umayyad forces, Ibn al-Muhallab left Basra with its treasury in hand, intending to march to Kufa. An advance party of Maslama's army sabotaged the canals south of Kufa, however, creating a flood that cut the Mohallabid army off from their destination, as well as from any possible reinforcement from Kufan supporters and family members, and leaving them stranded near Karbala in August 720, where Maslama's main force would catch them on August 17th. An initial engagement set the tone of the battle, with an advance force near Yazid's brother Abd al-Malik ibn al-Muhallab initially driving back the Umayyads' own advance party under al-Abbas ibn al-Walid and nearly claiming victory, only to be routed when the Syrians managed to rally and regroup with the bank of the Euphrates at their backs. Abd al-Malik would regroup with the rest of the army, digging trenches to fortify their camp next to a bridge across the Euphrates, and stationing part of the army on the opposite bank to protect a line of retreat. However, these precautions would not save the Mohallabid rebellion when the battle was finally joined. According to the sometimes unreliable testimony of the historian Abu Miknaf, Yazid ibn al-Muhallab favoured a night attack on the Umayyad camp to fill in the Umayyads' own trenches under the cover of darkness and prepare for a decisive assault at daybreak, but was overruled by the chiefs and leaders among his army, who insisted they abide by the terms of honourable combat under the Quran they had agreed upon with the Umayyads prior. Yazid disagreed, claiming the Umayyads were unlikely to show the same chivalry. This odd episode is likely coloured by Abu Miknaf's anti-Umayyad biases, but the battle itself bore out his supposed warning, with the Umayyads opening the full-scale battle on August 25th by sending a force in small boats to set the bridge ablaze and divide the Mohallabid army. On top of cutting off a line of retreat and stranding some of Yazid's forces on the opposite side of the river from the battle, the torching of the bridge was already enough on its own to cause many of Yazid's questionably dedicated soldiers to break and attempt to flee, only to be rounded up and beheaded as an example on their own commander's orders, leaving the Mohallabid ranks in chaos before the first blows were even traded. A greater blow would be the death of Yazid's brother, Habib, who commanded the Mohallabid right flank, and perished early in the battle. The death of his brother, combined with the other setbacks and pressing defeat, seems to have unbalanced the elderly Mohallabid leader, whose words and behavior following are marked with a single-mindedness bordering on madness. Dismissing advice to retreat to Wasit, he pressed on with the remains of his wavering forces, charging straight for the Umayyad center where Maslama was camped, with little care for maneuver or nuance. The greater Umayyad numbers and Yazid's seeming death wish made the outcome of the battle certain. Yazid and his companions clashed with Syrian cavalry until their defeat, with a warrior named Al-Qal ibn al-Ayyash fighting his way to Yazid, whereupon the two men dealt each other fatal blows. Another of Yazid's brothers, al-Mufaddal, commanded the left wing with more skill and discipline, and even saw some success after the routing of the rest of the army. But when news reached him of the deaths of his brothers and the flight of his allies, he fled the battlefield, the decisive battle ending whatever threat the Muhallabids posed. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion was nearly as bloody as the battle that preceded it, with both sides vengefully executing whatever prisoners they had, including Adi ibn Attat in Basra and numerous members of the Muhallabid family that had been arrested at the rebellion's inception, while Maslama, taking over as governor of Iraq, pursued the fleeing al-Mufaddal and other prominent rebels to Fars, where they were finally slain. Though quite large in scale, this rebellion was fairly short-lived, and its impact on history would likely not have been great if not for the previously mentioned Abbasids building support for their own ambitions. With the power of the Muhallabid family broken, its loyalists and more distant kinsmen, not caught in the purge, pledged their still respectable power to the Abbasids, and the family would return to prominence in later decades as vassals to another caliphate. Thus, this rebellion is somewhat more significant as one of the several leading into the Third Fitna. The Umayyad victory only bolstered the strength of tomorrow's enemies. For now, though, as the Abbasids bide their time and the deteriorating Arab possession in Transoxiana sees fighting rock Samarkand, our attention returns to Al-Andalus and southern France. The previously mentioned Andalusian governor, Al-Sam ibn Malik, now more secure in his new holdings and reforms, chose in early 721 to continue the conquests of the Umayyads further northwards into the lands of the Franks, gathering an impressive army, likely 10,000 to 15,000 strong, even if the six-digit figures given in Frankish accounts are dismissed. On top of bringing further prizes and revenues for himself and the Caliph by his conquests, Al-Sam seems to have rushed into further outward expansion, in part to keep the fragile harmony within Al-Andalus, hoping the Arab and Berber soldiers and settlers so recently at each other's throats could come together for plunder and holy war in France, rather than returning to their infighting at home. Narbonne was established and provisioned as the forward base from which the campaign would be launched, while to the north, Duke Odo of Aquitaine gathered forces of his own and sent out calls for aid. Though the exact date of his advance into Francia is unclear, it coincidentally seems to have taken place very shortly after the death of the Frankish king Chilperic II, leaving Francia technically under the rule of Theuderic IV, an 8-year-old boy. However, this was far less significant than it might sound. Real power was held by the steward, Charles Martel, who held the rather odd title of mayor over all the Frankish kingdoms after his victory in a many-sided struggle that had started as a civil war for Charles's native Austrasia. When Chilperic, then king of Neustria, had attempted to take advantage of the chaos and jointly invaded with King Radbod of Frisia, their opportunism backfired, with Charles eventually defeating not only his Austrasian rival, Plectrude, and the invaders, but also the previously mentioned Odo, who briefly joined Chilperic as an ally once the Neustrian king's war was a defensive one. Finally betrayed by Odo and delivered into Charles's hands, Chilperic surrendered most of his authority to Charles, being elevated to become king of all the Franks in name, but in truth serving as nothing more than a puppet, less than 3 years earlier in 718. Chilperic's passing and the crowning of Theuderic by Charles removed any lingering internal threat to the steward's power, and allowed him to consolidate his hard-won position. But despite this new security, Charles would not be coming to answer his former enemy Odo's call for reinforcement. Though Charles Martel would become famous throughout Europe for his later efforts against the Moors, at this point, his efforts were still focused on fighting the invading Saxons, and it's likely that seeing his powerful and functionally independent Aquitanian vassal weakened was to his benefit as well. Odo would thus be forced to stand alone against Al-Sam's invasion, though he would prove himself far from helpless. Initially unopposed as they left Narbonne in spring, the Arab and Berber force arrived at Aquitaine's largest city of Toulouse in early March of 721, their momentum halting as they settled in for a siege, but with the advantage seemingly still on their side. But the 3 months the cavalry-heavy Muslim army spent waiting outside the walls of Toulouse robbed them of the advantages in speed and mobility that had allowed such rapid conquests in Spain, and it seems Al-Sam may have allowed himself to become complacent, while Odo assembled his army of perhaps 8,000 to 12,000 soldiers, not expecting significant resistance after his string of easy victories against the remnants of the Visigoths. In an apparent failure of scouting, despite his access to thousands of skilled horsemen, Al-Sam allowed Odo's army to march south of Toulouse by the beginning of June, cutting the Muslims off from Narbonne and trapping them between the field army and the besieged city's garrison. As with so many other battles turned into myths to glorify a religious victory, the exact events of the battle that erupted on June 9th are difficult to pin down, with both sides claiming absurdly inflated army sizes in excess of 300,000 for their enemy. What is clear is that after a skillful encirclement of the besieging Muslim force by Odo, the defenders of Toulouse took a bold risk in sallying forth to join the battle in the field. To their credit, the Muslims did not quickly break or rout, despite their disadvantage and the simmering distrust still felt by many along the Arab-Berber divide. Rallying around Al-Sam, they fought a dogged last stand even after their leader's mortal injury, and after hours of fighting, a portion of the army even managed to break the encirclement and escape to Narbonne with the injured governor. With their mobility advantage nullified and enemies on all sides, though, this brave stand did little to change the inevitable outcome, and the majority of the Muslim invasion force was either taken prisoner and ransomed or perished in battle on the bloody fields outside Toulouse, while Al-Sam succumbed to his wounds in Narbonne not long after. This would not be the last attempt of the Umayyads to invade France, but Toulouse was nothing less than a disaster for the Umayyads, particularly with the dangers posed by a revanchist rival kingdom so close to home. The recently founded Kingdom of Asturias, ignored for their defensible terrain and comparative poverty in favour of more lucrative targets in France, would win its own first victory against the conquering Umayyads the following year at Covadonga, a relatively small-scale but historically significant skirmish marked by many today as the beginning of the Reconquista, which we will cover in a separate series. These developments, together with the growing power of the Abbasids in Khorasan, represented many pivotal events and transformations in their infancy, and the dawn of a new era just around the corner as the sun began to set on the Umayyads. After the death of Caliph Yazid in 724, the first consequence of his successor Hisham's rise to power would be something of a disaster. During the last year of Yazid's reign, a major expedition into Transoxiana had been planned by the then governor Muslim ibn Said al-Kilabi. The army raised, like most Umayyad armies, included significant detachments from tribes loyal to both the Qays and Yamani tribal federations of Arabia, two rival groups that had grown in power and spread across the domains of the caliphate with every conquest. In the past, the Yamani had been the favoured faction of the Umayyad caliphs, with the Qays even siding with the Zubayrids during the Second Fitna. Though following the Second Fitna's conclusion, the Umayyads opted to make efforts to reconcile with the Qays and win their support, rather than punishing them for their rebellion. Yet the Caliphate's efforts to remain neutral and above the feud were felt as a betrayal by the loyal Yamani. This would lead to serious tension when, shortly after the campaign was launched, the throne changed hands, and the new caliph had al-Kilabi replaced as governor. Though removed from his post, al-Kilabi decided to continue with his campaign, but this would cause the simmering rivalries between the Qays and Yamani to spring to life. As al-Kilabi belonged to the Qaysi, the Yamani contingent under Amr ibn Muslim refused to follow him across the Oxus after his demotion, preferring to wait for him to be recalled and follow his replacement into battle instead.
The first fighting in al-Kilabi's grand campaign would occur outside Balkh and be Arab against Arab, with al-Kilabi and his loyal followers bringing the Yamani to heel by force. A poor start to a doomed campaign. Weakened by internal conflict, and with many of the defeated Yamani deserting, al-Kilabi's diminished army joined with Sogdian and Hephthalite allies from still loyal principalities such as Samarkand and Saganian to march against Turgesh-aligned Fergana. No sooner would they arrive than their hopes were dashed by the news that Khan Suluk, Khan of the Turgesh and their turncoat former ally, was prepared for them and already en route with a large army. Tasking his Persian quartermaster Abdallah to organize a retreat, al-Kilabi attempted to withdraw his forces in good order, but was harried for 9 days by Turgesh horsemen during this retreat, with parts of his army being attacked piecemeal, as some of the lesser tribes and local allies were split from the main force. Crossing the Jaxartes would mean relative safety for the retreating army, and they ended the 9th day close by, though al-Kilabi opted to make camp rather than travel by darkness and risk nighttime raids. This would prove a mistake though, as the Turgesh-aligned forces of Fergana and Tashkent used this opportunity to maneuver themselves between the river and the retreating Arabs. Al-Kilabi's army, already exhausted from more than a week of forced marching, awoke to find enemies both before and behind them, their path of retreat and access to water cut off. With no other options, al-Kilabi ordered his exhausted army forward, beginning a battle that would be remembered as the Day of Thirst. The day was won by the Muslims, but the cost was heavy. The rearguard's commander, Humayd ibn Abdallah, died in battle to hold off the Turgesh pursuers, but the bulk of the army eventually succeeded in breaking through the enemy lines to cross the river. Ultimately, the heavy casualties and abandonment by local allies meant this Pyrrhic victory on the Jaxartes massively weakened caliphal power in Transoxiana, with the Arabs withdrawing to more secure frontiers around Balkh, as former vassals abandoned the caliphate in favour of the Turgesh, and by extension the Tang Empire of China's sphere of influence, despite the new governor Asad ibn Abdallah's best efforts to rebuild trust and good relations with the caliphate's local Sogdian allies over the next 3 years. The worsening rivalry between the Qaysi and Yamani federations would be of further concern as well, with some tribal leaders among the spurned Yaman Federation joining the Mohallabids in clandestine support for the Abbasid clan's whispers of revolution, and one even turning to the Kharijite heresy and embarking on a short, doomed rebellion in Yemen the following year. The years 724 to approximately 727 saw the caliphate remain fairly stable and secure, if not entirely at peace. Cyprus was raided by sea, and attacks on the Byzantines by the long-serving general Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik continued in Anatolia, with Caesarea being conquered in mid-726. The Eastern Roman Empire was far from toothless, however. Emperor Leo the Isaurian, who had beaten back the massive siege of Constantinople some years prior, had ended the years of anarchy that saw so many emperors raised and deposed, and brought a measure of stability back to the caliphate's oldest rival. Under pressure and unable to compete with the caliphate in direct military might, Leo's hopes lay with his ally on the caliphate's northern frontier, the Khazar Khaganate. 727 would see the Caucasus Mountains become a major battleground for the still recently enthroned Hisham, part of the ongoing Arab-Khazar Wars that will be the focus of an upcoming series. The Khazars would not be the only threat to face the caliphate in this period, and the following year of 728 only spelled further trouble both in the north and east, with even Samarkand, which had long served as the stronghold and regional capital for the caliphate in Transoxiana, erupting in unrest. Following the Day of Thirst, Governor Asad ibn Abdallah al-Kasri had initially succeeded in stabilizing the Umayyad hold, but with the tribal feud within his ranks worsening and Abbasid-backed missionaries and seditionists beginning to make their presence felt in the caliphate's far east, al-Kasri seems to have been overtaken by paranoia by 726, dealing out punishments to many perceived enemies, some severe and some humiliating, flogging his predecessor's right-hand man, Nasser ibn Sayyar, having a collection of tribal leaders imprisoned and shaved bald repeatedly in mockery, and chopping off the legs and hands of a suspected seditionist.
These and other actions began to alienate both his forces and the locals, and led to his replacement in 728 by Ashras ibn Abdallah al-Salami. Hoping to inspire greater support and loyalty from the locals, Ashras sent the missionary Abu al-Saida to Samarkand and the surrounding regions to call for conversion to Islam, with al-Saida promising the lifting of the jizya tax from all converts. His efforts were remarkably successful, bringing in numerous converts and building mosques in the city. But after Samarkand's ruler Gurak complained to Ashras of falling revenues and suggested some had simply feigned conversion to escape taxation, the governor eventually ordered the recent conversions to be ignored and the tax collection to continue as before. Outraged, more than 7,000 locals refused to pay their taxes, supported by Abu al-Saida in opposition to Ashras and the Caliphate. The imprisonment of the missionary and other leaders among the would-be rebels diffused the situation before it could devolve into bloodshed, but the disillusioned former followers of al-Saida sent offers of alliance to the Turgesh Khan Suluk to drive out the Caliphate from Samarkand, further undermining their hold. Things would only get worse in 729. Resolving to take the fight to Suluk with another offensive campaign, Ashras sent his vanguard commander, Qatan ibn Qutayba, son of the great conqueror Qutayba ibn Muslim, ahead of him across the Oxus, as he camped in Amul with the bulk of his army. Despite initial setbacks and raids on Qatan's camp, Ashras would score an initial victory in driving back the raiders and recovering their plunder as he advanced to join the vanguard, camping in the trading town of Baikand near Turkish-aligned Bukhara. But in a near repeat of the Day of Thirst, the Arab army was encircled by night, awakening to find themselves again cut off from water. In the following Battle of Baikand, despite thirst sapping the army's strength and the Turgesh killing more than 700 in the initial bloody engagements, Qatan and Ashras separately managed to break through enemy lines and escape with their forces, each thinking the other had perished for 2 days before rejoining each other among the still Arab-held forts near Bukhara. Ashras did seize victory of a sort from this setback. Suluk's pursuit was turned back after a bloody 2-month siege at the fort of Kamaja, initially driving its Arab garrison from their trenches outside the fort and storming the gates, only for the defenders to light blazing fires in the midst of the fighting and force the Turks back. After several failed attempts to break the defenders' resolve through assaults on the walls, attempts at bribery, and a mass execution of prisoners that was copied in equally grisly fashion by the defiant garrison, Suluk was forced to withdraw, allowing Ashras to lay siege to Bukhara and even capture it in 730 after wintering at a nearby oasis. But even this short victory would soon be for naught. In the aftermath of Baikand, Gurak defected to become another ally to the Turgesh, and though the sizable Arab garrison in Samarkand under Sora ibn al-Hur still held the city itself, it was now surrounded by hostile territory and ruling over a hostile population. When Suluk marched on Samarkand in 731 to restore Gurak to the lordship of his city, the new governor, al-Junayd ibn Abd al-Rahman, sent a large army, recorded as 28,000 strong, to relieve them. But the relief force would find itself besieged in turn after Suluk lifted the siege to intercept it in the steep, dry Taktakaracha pass between Kish and Samarkand. A battle broke out in the narrow pass, cavalry clashing on the more open Muslim right flank, while fierce fighting took place on foot against the cliffs on the Muslim left. Though the fighting was close, with slaves and the Arab baggage train even being offered their freedom to join the fighting, the Muslim right was soon broken and driven back, leaving al-Junayd under pressure in the centre. With the two battered armies separating at dusk, al-Junayd, tasting likely defeat in any further open battle, made the decision to dig trenches and fortify their camp despite the lack of a water source, sending orders to Samarkand's garrison of 12,000 to depart the city and relieve their relief force. As the garrison sallied forth on their mission, despite Sora's misgivings and attempted refusal, spies sent word of their coming ahead to Suluk and Gurak, who departed from the pass to seize their true prize, meeting them in battle atop a hill not far from the camp of al-Junayd. Here, without cliffs to protect their flanks or the numbers to match the Turgesh allied army, the garrison found themselves marching into grass fires set by their foes and harried by cavalry on all sides. The outnumbered force was soon shattered, run down and slaughtered by enemy horsemen as their confused formations broke up in the thick dust and smoke. Sora died in battle, and although al-Junayd would survive and escape thanks to this diversion, this decisive defeat, coupled with a religious revolt led by al-Harith ibn Saraij in 734 that united a portion of the Arab settlers with overtaxed local converts against the weakened Umayyads, would cause the almost total collapse of power in Arab Transoxiana for nearly a decade to follow. The most storied battle of Caliph Hisham's reign did not take place in Transoxiana, however, but in France. The Caliphate's previous defeat to Duke Odo at Toulouse, though a major setback, had not spelled the end of their ambitions in the region, and numerous raids were launched from the forward base of Narbonne during the 720s. 730 saw Duke Odo take advantage of the infighting in Al-Andalus to form an unusual alliance by giving his daughter Lampégie in marriage to Uthman ibn Naisa, often called Munuza in Frankish texts, a Berber leader in command of modern-day Catalonia. Though this deal would briefly stop the raids and bring a measure of security to Aquitaine, it would very quickly backfire when Uthman rose in rebellion against the recently appointed Arab governor Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi. With his allies' ill-advised rebellion swiftly crushed, Odo found himself facing not simple Berber raids, but the incensed and vengeful governor's army, which in early 732 launched a lightning attack into Navarre, seizing Bordeaux by storm and inflicting a heavy defeat on Odo at the River Garonne. With the hero of Toulouse bloodied and on the retreat, the path seemed open for a far greater offensive than Al-Sam's. But in an act of desperation, Odo swore fealty to his one-time rival Charles, steward to the puppet king Theuderic IV, and the effective ruler of the Franks. While Charles had been absent in Toulouse, he had not spent the intervening 11 years idly. Knowing a confrontation with Al-Andalus was inevitable, he had taken out a large loan from the Pope, equipping and training one of the only professional standing armies in Western Europe since the collapse of the Roman Empire. In comparison, Abdul-Rahman, though remembered as a just and generous leader in Arab texts, seemed quite unprepared for confrontation with a rival such as Charles, unsurprising considering the rapid turnover of Umayyad governors and the preoccupation with Arab-Berber rivalries closer to home that the governor had worked so hard to calm. With his foes on the move and Odo's independence broken, the mayor of all the Franks gathered up a powerful army to halt the Umayyad incursion, joining the remnants of Odo's forces in October at the city of Tours in the path of the Umayyad advance. Reaching Tours on October 4th, Abdul-Rahman and his army, heavily laden with plunder already, were surprised to find an army in an organized phalanx-like formation atop a hill just south of the city and the Loire River, and were left with the decision to fight or to abandon the loot they had taken at Bordeaux and withdraw. Tours was a rich prize, and Charles seemed to have relied on its attractiveness as a target, and Abdul-Rahman's confidence after his decisive victory at Garonne to compel the Arab leader to attack. If the Umayyad army chose to withdraw, Charles's army of heavy infantry would be ill-suited to pursue, and would risk annihilation if they broke formation to do so, leaving the decision to do battle in the hands of the Muslims. With more than 25,000 soldiers and high-quality heavy cavalry unmatched by the Christian kingdoms of Europe, bolstered by fresh Berber horsemen from Ifriqiya, Abdul-Rahman held some major advantages over his outnumbered foes of some 17,000 to 20,000. Yet a cavalry charge, devastating though it could be in the right circumstances, relied heavily on the terror it could inspire. If the Franks held their ground in the face of a charge, rather than breaking, their tight formation and the uphill fighting would render the governor's strongest weapon relatively impotent. Rather than rush to a decision, the Umayyad army made camp, waiting in standoff for 6 days. Though despite the approaching winter and the bitter cold setting in, the Franks did not abandon their defensive readiness atop the hill, the warmer clothing they had brought south with them from Austrasia serving them well as the invaders shivered in their camp. Finally, on October 10th, Abdul-Rahman made the decision to attack, worrying an order to abandon the treasure might lead to dissent in the ranks, and trusting his experienced soldiers to win him another victory. The main body of the Frankish army, Charles's professional heavy infantry held firm on the hilltop, while raiders from among levied and local troops were dispatched to harry the Umayyad rear, taking advantage of paths through the nearby forests to maneuver past the enemy army despite its greater numbers and mobility. Abd al-Rahman, for his part, is remembered as a capable general, but whether out of overconfidence or a desire to finish the battle swiftly before his army suffered another freezing October night, he played his hand early in the battle, riding with his best heavy cavalry in a series of charges at the battle's start that failed to dislodge the still fresh and eager Franks. Were he facing an army of levies and conscripts, as most of Western Europe would have sent against him, these heavy cavalry charges might have produced the panic and rout Abd al-Rahman hoped for, but instead casualties began to mount among the Umayyad army's finest, while the forests and nearby river prevented him encircling the mostly stationary Frankish army with his greater numbers. Despite the initial setbacks for the Umayyads, the battle was certainly not a one-sided one, and as the day of October 10th progressed, the outcome hung in the balance, with casualties on both sides rising until the armies parted at nightfall. The battle's end varies slightly between tellings, although most of the basic facts remain consistent. The official Frankish account, sponsored by the Carolingian dynasty, simply describes the Franks slaughtering their foes and driving them from the field with little further detail. The Mozarabic chronicle, contrarily, claims the Umayyads simply left during the night, with the Franks tensely awaiting another attack in the morning before discovering their foes' tents empty. The most complete account, and one that has worked its way into most tellings since, is an anonymous Arab chronicle that tells a somewhat different story than either. On the morning of the 11th, the Arabs returned to their attack on the Frankish formation, holding their own and, if the slightly dramatic telling is to be believed, breaking through the centre of the formation to push towards Charles, coming close to breaking the Franks completely. But a small force of Franks, likely levies or survivors from Odo's army, not trained to hold formation with Charles's professional soldiers, took advantage of paths through the forest to raid the Arab camp. Small though the force might have been, confusion and fog of war magnified its impact on the battle, with the attacking cavalry breaking off the attack to rush back to camp, worried their treasure might be stolen, or that a larger force could still be hidden among the forest to encircle them. Abd al-Rahman remained at the front and tried to stem the retreat, but the Franks were quicker to take advantage of the momentary confusion, surging forward and killing the governor and those around him with a hail of spears. If hope still remained to restore order to the disoriented army, Abd al-Rahman's death put an end to it, and the Franks soon turned the confusion into total rout. The Battle of Tours is today one of the most discussed and best remembered battles of the early Middle Ages, credited by some with ending the threat of the Caliphate to Western Europe. Its impact on history is a matter of some debate, particularly compared to the earlier battle at Toulouse. It is true that Tours looms much larger in Christian than Arab accounts. While the devastating defeat and Charles's prowess were certainly noted by Arab historians, it gets no more attention than Toulouse, even being absent from the quite thorough history of al-Tabari. It has been suggested by some that Charles and his Carolingian descendants' prominent place in European history caused their triumph at Tours to take exaggerated importance compared to the victory of the more obscure Duke Odo. And while it is true no further invasions of such a scale ever occurred, the Arabs did continue their raiding over the following years, and Berber revolts and the imminent splintering of the Caliphate likely had as much or more to do with the end of expansion than the defeat at Tours. Yet whether or not the Battle of Tours can be fully credited with ending the threat of the Caliphate in the West, the prestige it won Charles in the eyes of the Pope and the Franks, and more pragmatically, the forced subjugation of his last Frankish rival Odo, made it an important moment in the unification of the Frankish realm, paving the way for the Frankish Empire of his grandson Charlemagne to resurrect the spirit of Rome in the West, and serving as a founding moment of glory for the Carolingian dynasty. It was through this victory Charles would become known to his countrymen and to history as Charles Martel, or Martellus, the Hammer. The victory at Tours would not mark the end of the conflict Charles Martel and his Carolingian dynasty would wage against Al-Andalus though. The earlier victories over Odo and the Visigoths of Septimania meant portions of today's southern France remained in Muslim hands, and to some independence-minded Gallo-Roman nobility, particularly Duke Maurontus of Provence, Charles Martel's powerful and expansionist Frankish realm now seemed more of a threat than the Muslims. Though formerly subject to the Frankish crown for nearly a century, Gallo-Roman nobles with very old roots still ruled Provence more or less autonomously, and wished to maintain that independence in the face of the empire builder Charles. Thus, in 734, 2 years after their defeat at Tours, the Umayyads added Avignon to their realm, apparently not through conquest but through diplomacy, with Maurontus willing to forge alliances with non-Christians to avoid subjugation. Other accounts suggest that it was in fact conquered, along with Al in 735, by Narbonne's Umayyad governor Yusuf ibn Abd al-Rahman al-Fihri. And while the stronger evidence points to an alliance, it is certain Maurontus was under great pressure from both sides, and his alliance with Yusuf would have been an uneasy one at best. Whatever the case, with 735 also seeing Duke Odo's death, and Charles receiving the formal pledge of fealty from his successor, Hunald of Bordeaux, the stage was set for a new set of confrontations between the Hammer and the Caliphate. The Franks were this time on the offensive, with Charles deploying his brother Childebrand in 736 with an army to bring Provence to heel and drive out the Umayyads. As 736 ended, Avignon lay besieged, and both Umayyad relief armies and a larger Frankish force under Charles's command were being mobilized to take the field. The first fighting would occur at Avignon. Charles arrived in 737 before the expected relief army and opted not to wait out a long siege, launching a frontal assault against the walls of Avignon with rams and catapults, and battering down the gates, despite the best efforts of its Umayyad garrison. Though no numbers exist for the defenders, the characterization of the defense as a mostly Umayyad effort and Charles's confidence in his direct assault and its rapid success together suggest a small defending force, and further suggests the inhabitants of Avignon were not inclined to support their occupiers against the besiegers, the pragmatic alliances of their rulers not outweighing the religious divide for most. Following this, Charles marched for Narbonne in Septimania. Here, victory would not be so easy. The Umayyad relief army had by this point mobilized and crossed the Pyrenees under the command of Governor Uqba ibn al-Hajjaj, and the Septimanian provinces had been Umayyad for years now, with Narbonne much more firmly held and garrisoned than Avignon. To avoid being trapped between the relief army and a sortie from Narbonne's defenders, Charles left a token besieging force behind and continued past the city to meet the Umayyad army in the field, blocking their path at the River Bear. Here was fought a battle not so well remembered or recorded as Tours, but perhaps of similar importance. In the 5 years since his previous triumph, Charles's army had evolved and even adopted some of the techniques of its foes, with the Franks this time bringing heavy cavalry of their own to battle to match those of the Arabs. This addition to his ranks, along with the Umayyads being forced to cross the river and give the Franks the advantage of a defensive position, despite being the invaders, likely contributed to what quickly became Charles's second decisive victory over the Caliphate, with the Umayyad army's attempts to retreat being broken up by the rivers and rough terrain of the region, leaving numerous disorganized pockets of fleeing soldiers to be run down and captured by the Franks. This victory would not spell the end of the Umayyad presence in France entirely. The rebellions of Maurontus and Hunald proved more pressing, causing Charles to abandon what would have been a lengthy and difficult siege of Narbonne to quash them, though not before sacking the smaller city of Nîmes and leaving much of Septimania and Provence devastated. The death of the Merovingian king Theoderic in the same year left Charles a steward without a king to represent, possibly undermining the legal charade holding up his rule, though the forging of an alliance with the Lombards of Italy during this time demonstrates that Charles was powerful enough and secure enough in the throne that was his in all but name to ignore such questions of legitimacy for the time being. Septimania would remain Umayyad for over a decade more, and Hunald would prove a persistent nemesis for both Charles and his son Pepin after the Hammer's death in 741. But the proven military might of the Franks, the added weight of the Lombard alliance, and the Arab-Berber hostilities now brought to a boiling point by Kharijite preachers across Iberia and North Africa, meant the once-threatening caliphate could do little to aid its northern allies or protect its Septimanian holdings. The growing Carolingian Empire, so recently imperiled by Umayyad invasions, would be able to take the offensive at its own leisure in the years to follow. The next two sub-series of our series on the early Muslim expansion will continue this story, and we'll talk about the Arab-Khazar Wars and the rise and fall of the Abbasid Caliphate. To ensure you don't miss them, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.